The story of Germany begins long before the rise of kingdoms, borders, or written chronicles. It starts in the deep forests, river valleys, and broad plains of northern and central Europe, where scattered communities of early Indo-European peoples gradually formed what we now call the Germanic tribes. These societies did not think of themselves as a unified group, but over centuries they shared enough cultural, linguistic, and religious traditions that outsiders, especially the Romans, later on began describing them as a single family of peoples. Archaeologists traced the roots of early Germanic culture to the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, roughly in the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. The evidence comes from burial sites, pottery styles, metalwork, and settlements clustered near major rivers like the Elbe, the Weser, and the Rhine. These societies were small, rural, and tightly organized around kinship groups. There were no cities, no monumental buildings, and certainly no kings commanding huge territories. Instead, extended families and clans were the basic units of life, each responsible for its own survival and defense. Language played a central role in shaping identity. Over generations, the ancestors of the Germanic peoples developed a distinct branch of the Indo-European language family. This early Germanic tongue eventually split into many dialects and later into languages such as Gothic, Saxon, Norse, and others. But in these early centuries, a shared language made communication possible across great distances, helping ideas and traditions spread from tribe to tribe. The climate and landscape shaped their way of life. Much of northern Europe was covered with dense forests, wetlands, and rolling hills. Farming was limited by shorter growing seasons compared to the Mediterranean world. As a result, many Germanic communities combined agriculture with hunting, shearing, and small-scale trade. They grew grains like barley and wheat, raised cattle and pigs, and used the forests for timber, fuel, and wild game. The environment encouraged mobility and fostered a sense of independence within each tribe. Social structure revolved around free men who gathered in assemblies to settle disputes, make decisions, and choose leaders. These chieftains were not absolute rulers. Instead, their authority depended on reputation, bravery, and the loyalty of their followers. Gift-giving was an important part of leadership. A respected chief might distribute captured weapons, imported goods, or precious ornaments to show generosity and win allegiance. In return, warriors pledged support in battle. This pattern created a political world built on honor, personal loyalty, and communal judgment rather than centralized power. Religion gave meaning to life and death. The early Germanic peoples worshipped a pantheon of gods connected to war, fertility, and the natural world. Later, Norse mythology captures echoes of these ancient beliefs, describing deities like Odin, Thor, and Freya. Sacred groves, springs, and open fields served as places of worship. Priests or seers interpreted omens, read the flight of birds, or cast lots to guide important decisions. The belief that fate shaped each person's life encouraged a culture that valued courage, especially in battle. Trade networks connected the Germanic tribes to their neighbors long before Rome entered the story. Amber, a fossilized tree resin found along the Baltic coast, became a prized luxury item in the Mediterranean world. Traders carried it southward across many tribal regions, exchanging it for bronze tools, glass beads, wine, and other goods. These early contacts did not transform Germanic society, but they widened awareness and slowly introduced new objects, materials, and ideas. By the 1st millennium BCE, specific groupings of tribes began to appear more clearly in the archaeological and written record. Names like the Suebi, the Cherushi, the Chatti, the Marcomanni, and the Goths emerged later, but their roots lie in this earlier period. Their settlements grew, and their movements occasionally shifted entire population groups hundreds of miles over several generations. Migration did not always mean dramatic invasions, but often a gradual relocation of clans in search of better land or safer territory. One of the first outside observers to describe these peoples was the Greek explorer Pius, who sailed along the northern coast of Europe in the 4th century BCE CE. He did not use the word Germanic, but his brief descriptions show how distant and mysterious this region appeared to Mediterranean peoples. Later, more detailed accounts came from the Romans, who encountered the Germanic tribes through warfare, diplomacy, and trade. For now, though, in these earliest centuries, the tribes developed without any direct influence from Mediterranean empires. The lack of written records from the Germanic peoples themselves means that much of what we know comes from archaeology and later Roman sources. Sites such as the Jasov culture area in northern Germany and Denmark provide important clues. Weapons found in graves suggest a warrior society where spears, shields, and occasionally swords played central roles. Women were often buried with jewelry, household goods, or weaving tools, showing their economic and social importance. The practice of cremation or inhumation varied by region and time, reflecting diverse beliefs about death and the afterlife. Despite living in small communities, the Germanic tribes were not isolated. They formed alliances, fought rival groups, and sometimes displaced weak neighbors. Power could shift quickly depending on the success of a chieftain or the pressure of external threats. Such competition laid the groundwork for larger coalitions in later centuries, especially as tribes confronted powerful states to the south. Technology improved gradually. Iron became more common, allowing stronger tools and weapons. Communities built long houses to shelter multiple families under one roof along with their livestock during harsh winters. Over time, settlements became more stable with fields cultivated year after year rather than shifting frequently. These developments did not turn the Germanic world into a centralized civilization, but they supported population growth and increased regional diversity. Cultural values centered on bravery, hospitality, and loyalty to family. Later Roman authors, although biased, often commented on what they saw as the fierce independence of the tribes. For example, the historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century CE, noted that Germanic warriors regarded fleeing from battle as a grave dishonor and believed that a leader should remain in front of his men. While such statements must be read carefully, they reflect real themes found across early Germanic societies: a warrior ethos, pride in lineage, and a deep sense of communal belonging. As the centuries passed, pressures from outside regions increased. To the east, nomadic peoples on the Eurasian steppe occasionally pushed westward, triggering migrations or conflicts among neighboring tribes. To the south, Celtic groups occupied large areas of Central Europe, interacting with Germanic settlers along shifting frontier zones. These encounters were not always violent, but they introduced new weapons, pottery styles, and social customs. The Germanic world was already changing well before the Romans arrived. By the final centuries BCE, larger confederations of tribes began to appear. These alliances formed for mutual protection or to control desirable lands. Some groups, such as the Suebi under their leader Ariovistus, became powerful enough to move into Gaul and challenge other tribes. This expansion eventually caught the attention of Rome, whose growing influence brought it into direct contact with the Germanic peoples for the first time. Rome's early awareness of these northern tribes marked an important turning point. When Julius Caesar campaigned in Gaul in the 1st century BCE, he wrote about Germanic warriors crossing the Rhine to support their allies. He described them as fierce fighters, with simple lifestyles and strong discipline. Although his comments were shaped by political motives, they represent the moment when the Germanic world entered the written history of the Mediterranean. By the closing centuries before the Common Era, the world of the Germanic tribes began to shift as they came into closer contact with a new and powerful neighbor to the south, the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire. Rome was expanding steadily, securing territories across Gaul and pushing its influence toward the lands bordering the Rhine River. This contact did not immediately result in conquest, but it created tension, curiosity, trade, and eventually open conflict. From these encounters emerged one of the most significant turning points in early German history, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, and the figure who led the tribes to victory, Arminius. Rome's interest in the northern frontier grew as its armies moved through Gaul under leaders like Julius Caesar. Once Rome controlled most of the region, the Germanic tribes living east of the Rhine appeared as both an opportunity and a challenge. Some Roman commanders believed these lands could be conquered and turned into new provinces, just like Gaul. Others viewed the rugged forests, marshes, and fiercely independent locals as too costly to subdue. Still, the idea of extending Roman order and taxation into Germania continued to tempt Roman leaders. Trade increased along the frontier. Germanic tribes exchanged furs, amber and cattle for Roman metal tools, wine, pottery, and coins. These goods traveled along the Rhine, which became a major boundary separating two very different cultures. Rome used diplomacy to manage tribal politics, forming alliances with some groups while pressuring others. Roman commanders also recruited Germanic warriors as auxiliary troops, recognizing their skill in battle. In doing so, they often brought tribal leaders into Roman military networks, shaping their loyalties in subtle ways. But tension remained. Roman expansion into Germania was not just a political or economic project. It was also tied to military prestige. Ambitious commanders believed victory on the frontier could elevate their careers. The tribes, however, valued independence and were wary of foreign control. As Rome began establishing forts east of the Rhine, resistance grew. This set the stage for one of the most dramatic and consequential confrontations between the two worlds. During the reign of Emperor Augustus, Roman policy took a decisive turn. Commanders such as Drusus and later Tiberius campaigned deep into Germanic territory. These campaigns aimed to pacify local resistance, collect tribute, and lay the groundwork for a new Roman province in the region. The strategy seemed promising at first. Some tribes made temporary alliances with Rome, hoping to gain protection against rivals. Roman forts, roads, and supply lines stretched farther east each season. The empire appeared on the verge of completing a major expansion. Among the Germanic aristocracy influenced by this new reality was a young man named Arminius. Born into the Cherusci tribe, he was sent to Rome as a hostage in his youth, a common Roman practice for managing tribal alliances. There he received military training, learned Latin, and eventually earned Roman citizenship and the rank of equestrian. Arminius fought in Roman armies and gained first-hand knowledge of its tactics, discipline, and weaknesses. Rome believed he was a loyal ally, but in reality he was becoming a powerful strategist who understood both cultures. The turning point came when Publius Quintilius Varus, a trusted administrator of Emperor Augustus, was appointed to govern the newly subdued lands between the Rhine and the Elbe. Varus, known more for civil administration than military brilliance, aimed to integrate the region into the Roman provincial system. He imposed taxes, enforced Roman legal practices, and demanded obedience from local leaders. These measures deeply angered many tribes who saw them as an attack on their customs and independence. Arminius recognized an opportunity. He used his position as a Roman officer and trusted advisor to Varus to conceal his growing coalition of Germanic tribes. Behind the scenes, he gathered leaders from various groups, Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, and others, persuading them that Rome intended to strip them of freedom. His argument rested not only on emotion, but also on strategic insight. Arminius understood that a direct confrontation with Roman legions in open battle would likely fail. Instead, he proposed a trap, one that exploited terrain, weather, and the Roman belief that they had already pacified the region. In the years spelled out, 9 of the Common Era, Varus marched with 3 legions, tens of thousands of men, into what he thought was a secure area to settle a minor uprising. Led by Arminius's guidance, he moved into the densely wooded region, later called the Teutoburg Forest. Heavy rain, muddy paths, and narrow routes, slow, wed the Roman column. Their usual discipline, tight formations, and offensive preparations became harder to maintain. They were stretched out, vulnerable, and unprepared for the assault that was about to begin. Arminius and his coalition struck with devastating effect. Warriors attacked from concealed positions, overwhelming Roman units before they could regroup. The forest confined the Romans, denying them the space needed for their traditional battle formations. Over several days of relentless fighting, Roman morale collapsed. Varus, realizing the disaster unfolding around him, took his own life. By the end, the legions were completely destroyed. Their standards were captured, their soldiers killed or enslaved, and their presence in the region effectively erased. The scale of the defeat shocked the Roman Empire. Augustus reportedly cried out in despair, begging for his lost legions to be returned. The battle forced Rome to abandon its plans to fully conquer Germania east of the Rhine. Instead, the empire focused on securing and fortifying its western frontier. This led to the construction of the lines, a network of border defenses stretching across hundreds of miles. The lines included watchtowers, forts, palisades, and earthworks designed to monitor movement, defend against raids, and stabilize the frontier. Arminius became a central figure in Germanic history. Though his legacy was complex after the victory, he attempted to unite the tribes into a larger political force. But internal rivalries and fears of domination prevented such unity. Eventually, Arminius was assassinated by members of his own people who felt threatened by his growing influence. Still, his achievement lived on. He had halted Roman expansion and shaped the geopolitical landscape of Central Europe for centuries to come. Rome did not entirely retreat from the region after the defeat. Instead, it shifted from aggressive conquest to careful management. Roman commanders launched retaliatory campaigns seeking to recover lost honor and punish hostile tribes. While these operations achieved some success, they never reversed the basic outcome of the Teutoburg disaster. Rome accepted the Rhine as its permanent boundary, recognizing that the cost of conquest outweighed the potential gain. The frontier became a zone of constant interaction. Roman soldiers, traders, and diplomats moved along the Rhine and Danube, negotiating with tribal leaders and maintaining alliances. Many Germanic warriors continued to serve in Roman auxiliary units, gaining wealth and skills that later influenced their own communities. Trade flourished, bringing Roman goods into Germanic homes and introducing tribal products to Roman markets. At the same time, occasional raids and conflicts kept the frontier tense, reminding both sides of the fragile peace. Over time, the limes took on more than a military function. It became a cultural boundary as well. To the south of this line, Roman cities grew with stone buildings, paved roads, and vibrant markets. To the north, Germanic communities maintained their rural settlements, tribal assemblies, and traditional ways of life. The contrast was visible, but not absolute. Cultural exchange flowed in both directions, gradually blending elements of each world in areas near the frontier. The battle led by Arminius did more than stop Roman conquest. It preserved the distinct development of the Germanic peoples. Without Roman provincial integration, the tribes continued evolving on their own terms. Their languages remained independent, their political structures stayed decentralized, and their warrior culture endured for many generations. This allowed Germanic groups to become major actors later in European history, especially during the migrations and state formati that followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Roman setback also shaped imperial strategy for centuries. Emperors invested heavily in frontier defense, recognizing that the Germanic world was too vast and too fragmented to conquer fully. The Rhine and Danube rivers became the backbone of Roman security. Commanders stationed along the frontier learned to navigate tribal politics carefully. Sometimes Rome supported one tribe against another. Sometimes it recruited entire groups as allies. Diplomacy became just as important as military strength. The collapse of Roman authority in Western Europe brought enormous change to the lands inhabited by the Germanic peoples. Rome had never conquered the deep interior of Germania, but its influence shaped the regions along the Rhine and Danube for centuries. When the Western Empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, the balance of power shifted decisively. Germanic tribes, who once lived along the frontier, now moved, expanded, or reorganized into new political formations. Among these emerging powers, none would shape the future of Central Europe more profoundly than the Franks. The Franks were not originally a single unified people. Instead, they were a loose coalition of smaller tribes living along the lower Rhine and in the regions that are now the Netherlands, Belgium, and Western Germany. Their early history shows a pattern of flexibility and adaptation. Unlike some tribes who sought to invade Roman lands through force alone, the Franks built their position by combining military strength, diplomacy, and selective cooperation with Roman authorities. Over time, this strategy gave them opportunities that other groups did not enjoy. As the Roman frontier weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Franks expanded into northern Gaul. Some groups received permission from Roman commanders to say veteres federati, federated allies expected to defend the frontier. Others pushed southward independently, taking advantage of Roman administrative decline. This dual approach allowed the Franks to grow in population, resources, and territorial influence, while maintaining a reputation as both fierce fighters and useful allies. The turning point in Frankish history came with the rise of the Merovingian dynasty named after the semi-legendary figure, Merovich. His descendants transformed the Franks from a loose tribal network into a powerful kingdom. The most significant of these early rulers was Clovis, spelled out as Clovis, though his name appears in various historical forms. Clovis, who lived in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, understood that to succeed, he needed more than military victory. He needed legitimacy and unity. After defeating rival Germanic and Gallo-Romanic and Gallo-Roman leaders, he consolidated control over much of Gaul. One of Clovis's most important decisions was his conversion to Christianity, specifically the form practiced by the Roman Church, rather than the Arian Christianity followed by several other Germanic kingdoms. According to later accounts, this decision came after a battlefield vow in which he promised to convert if he achieved victory. Whether this moment happened exactly as described is less important than the political effect it produced. By embracing the Church, supported by the Roman population, Clovis gained powerful allies among bishops and local elites. This strengthened his position and helped unify diverse peoples under Frankish rule. The Merovingian kingdom grew into a major force in Western and Central Europe. Yet the Merovingian kings eventually lost much of their real power, leaving governance in the hands of powerful officials known as mayors of the palace. Over time, these mayors became the effective rulers of the Frankish Rio. May among them was the Carolingian family, whose influence would reshape not only Frankish lands, but the entire European continent. The Carolingians rose to prominence in the 7th and 8th centuries by expanding military power, supporting the church, and promoting administrative reforms. Charles Martel, often called Charles the Hammer, became especially famous for his victory near Ty, where Frankish forces turned back a Muslim army advancing from the Iberian Peninsula. Although this confrontation has sometimes been exaggerated in later memory, it demonstrated the Carolingians' growing influence and military capability. Charles Martel's son, Pippin the Short, took a decisive step when he deposed the last Merovingian king and had himself declared king of the Franks with the support of the papacy. This alliance between Frankish rulers and the Roman Church laid the foundation for a new understanding of political authority in Europe, one in which a Christian king could claim divine sanction for unifying and defending Christendom. The true architect of this emerging order was Pippin's son Charlemagne, known in German as Karl Dross. Charlemagne's long reign fundamentally transformed the political and cultural landscape of Europe. He expanded Frankish territory through campaigns against the Saxons, Lombards, Bavarians, and other groups. His war against the Saxons in particular was long and brutal, aiming not only to defeat them, but also to incorporate them into a Christian kingdom. These conquests extended Frankish authority deep into Central Europe, establishing the foundation for regions that would later become part of medieval Germany. Charlemagne was more than a conqueror. He pursued administrative and cultural reforms that strengthened his realm. He appointed local counts to administer territories, sent royal agents to ensure loyalty, and supported the creation of monasteries and schools. This revival of learning, often called the Carolingian Renaissance, preserved important Latin texts, improved literacy among clerics, and encouraged artistic and architectural achievements. While limited in its reach, it had a lasting influence on European intellectual life. The most symbolic moment of Charlemagne's reign came in the early 9th century when he traveled to Rome and was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III. The title, Emperor of the Romans, revived an idea that had disappeared in the West since the fall of the ancient Roman Empire. The coronation signaled a close partnership between the Frankish monarchy and the Church, blending Germanic kingship with Roman imperial tradition. Although Charlemagne did not seek to replicate the Roman Empire in every form, the title gave his rule a new prestige and a sense of continuity with the ancient past. After Charlemagne's death, his empire faced internal pressures. His grand vision could not easily survive division among his heirs. In the mid-9th century, the Treaty of Verdun separated the empire into three main parts, with the eastern portion becoming the foundation of what would later be recognized as the German kingdom. This eastern realm included diverse regions such as Saxony, Bavaria, Franconia, and Suabia, each with its own traditions and leaders. While unified under the Carolingian legacy, these regions retained strong local identities that would influence the future political shape of Germany. The Carolingian line weakened over time and local rulers gained greater autonomy. Out of this shifting landscape emerged new leaders who sought to strengthen the Eastern Kingdom. Among them was Henry the Fowler, the Duke of Saxony, who became king in the early 10th century. Henry's leadership marked a renewed effort to unify the eastern lands and defend them against external threats, particularly the Magyar raiders. From the east, Henry's son, Otto of Fie, often called Otto the Great, continued this consolidation through military success and alliances with the Church. Otto strengthened the monarchy and expanded influence into Italy. His victory over the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld secured the eastern frontier and solidified his authority. In recognition of his achievements, Otto was crowned emperor by the Pope, establishing what historians later called the Holy Roman Empire. This empire was neither purely Roman nor entirely German, yet it drew from both traditions. Its rulers claimed the legacy of Rome while governing a realm centered on German-speaking regions. Unlike the unified empires of the ancient world, the Holy Roman Empire was a complex confederation of duchies, bishoprics, monasteries, and cities. Power was shared, negotiated, and often contested. Kings relied on the support of nobles in the church, granting privileges and titles to maintain alliances. This decentralized structure became one of the defining features of medieval Germany. With the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, the political landscape of Central Europe entered a new and intricate phase. The empire brought together duchies, bishoprics, counties, and emerging towns under the authority of a king who could, with papal approval, become emperor. Yet this authority was never absolute. Over the course of the medieval era, power within the empire became increasingly decentralized, shaped by the ambitions of regional princes, the rise of cities, and long-standing tensions between secular rulers and the church. These developments created a world in which Germany, far from being a unified realm, became a mosaic of competing powers, each with its own identity, traditions, and interests. In the centuries following the reign of Otto the Great, the empire continued to evolve through shifting alliances and expand. Ding social institutions. One of the most significant forces shaping medieval Germany was the growing autonomy of regional dukes and princes. These rulers controlled large territories, commanded their own armies, collected taxes, and dispensed justice. Their power often rivaled that of the emperor, especially during periods of weak central leadership. This rise of local authority was partly a result of geography. The empire stretched across vast and varied landscapes, from the North Sea coast to the Alps, making centralized administration difficult. Roads were limited, communication slow, and travel dangerous. In such a world, local rulers were essential for maintaining order and responding to regional challenges. Over time, their practical authority translated into political legitimacy. Many princes claimed ancient rights and customs that allowed them to govern independently while still acknowledging the emperor as a symbolic figure of unity. The church also played a major role in this system. Bishops and abbots controlled extensive lands and held significant political influence. Unlike secular lords, they were appointed rather than born into their positions. Emperors saw this as an opportunity. By appointing loyal clergy to important posts, they could extend their influence into regions where hereditary nobles resisted imperial control. In return, church leaders relied on imperial support for protection and legitimacy. However, this arrangement sparked a major conflict known to history as the investiture controversy. The issue centered on who had the right to appoint bishops, the emperor or the pope. Emperors argued that as secular leaders responsible for maintaining the realm, they needed loyal church officials in key positions. The papacy insisted that spiritual authority must remain free from secular interference. This struggle came to a head during the reign of Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. When Gregory challenged imperial authority, Henry responded by declaring the pope deposed. The pope in turn excommunicated Henry, releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. The conflict escalated until Henry made a dramatic journey to the fortress of Canossa in the Alps, where he sought absolution in the middle of winter. Although this act temporarily restored his standing, the struggle between empire and papacy continued for generations. In the end, neither side achieved complete victory. The Concordat of Worms, reached in the early 12th century, offered a compromise. The church would appoint bishops, but the emperor retained a role in the process. This settlement reflected the broader reality of medieval Germany. Overlapping spheres of authority that constantly required negotiation, while emperors and princes contested political power. Economic and social life across the empire changed profoundly. One of the most important developments was the rise of towns and cities. These urban centers emerged as hubs of trade, craftsmanship, and cultural exchange. Their growth was fueled by expanding long-distance commerce, especially in goods such as cloth, metal, work, salt, and grain. Merchants formed guilds to regulate trade, protect members, and maintain standards. Skilled craftsmen organized similar associations, creating a growing middle class with interests distinct from those of nobles or peasants. Cities sought and often received charters granting them privileges such as the right to hold markets, collect tolls, or govern themselves through elected councils. These freedoms made towns attractive to settlers, seeking economic opportunity or relief from the restrictions of rural life. The legal principle, city air, makes one free captured the idea that urban life could offer greater personal autonomy than the countryside. As cities expanded, they gained political weight, sometimes challenging nearby nobles or even the emperor. In the northern regions of the empire, a powerful commercial network known as the Hanseatic League emerged. Centered around cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen, the League connected merchants across the Baltic and North Seas. Its members cooperated to defend trade routes, negotiate privileges with foreign rulers, and secure commercial monopolies. Although not a political state, the Hanseatic League demonstrated the growing influence of urban commerce in German-speaking lands. Wealth generated by trade allowed these cities to build impressive town halls, churches, and public works, enriching their cultural and architectural heritage. Alongside urban development, the medieval era also witnessed significant agricultural expansion. New techniques, such as the use of the heavy plow and the adoption of crop rotation, allowed farmers to cultivate land that had previously been unproductive. Population increased and rural settlements multiplied. The clearing of forests and drainage of wetlands transformed the landscape, bringing more territory under cultivation and supporting a growing society. Despite this growth, medieval life remained shaped by hierarchy. The majority of people were peasants who worked the land under various forms of obligation to local lords. Some were serfs, bound to the estate, while others held more flexible arrangements. Lords provided protection and justice in exchange for labor, rent, or military service. These relationships varied widely depending on region and local custom, reinforcing the patchwork nature of the empire. The cultural and intellectual world of medieval Germany flourished within monasteries, cathedral schools, and emerging universities. Monastic communities served as centers of learning, contributing to scholarship, manuscript production, and the preservation of classical texts. Cathedrals and churches became architectural masterpieces, reflecting the religious devotion and wealth of both the clergy and lay patrons. Romanesque and later Gothic styles transformed the skyline with stone vaults, soaring spires, and intricate sculptures. Literature began to take shape in the German language during this period. Epic poems, lyrical songs, and courtly tales emerged from the courts of nobles and the gatherings of poets, known as Minnesingens. Stories such as the Nibelungenlied blended mythic themes with medieval values, creating works that would influence German culture for centuries. These cultural developments reflected a society growing more confident in its identity, even as it remained politically divided. The tensions between local autonomy and imperial ambition reached new heights during the reigns of emperors from the Hohenstaufen dynasty, particularly Frederick I, known as Frederick Barbarossa, and his grandson Frederick I. Barbarossa sought to restore strong central authority and strengthen imperial influence in Italy, where the empire held long-standing claims. His efforts, however, brought him into conflict with the papacy and with Italian city-states determined to preserve their independence. Frederick II, raised in Sicily and fluent in multiple languages, brought a cosmopolitan perspective to imperial rule. His legal reforms and intellectual patronage made a lasting impact, but his clashes with the papacy undermined efforts to consolidate authority in the German lands. Both emperors achieved moments of great prestige, yet their struggles highlighted the inherent limits of imperial power within a politically fragmented realm. By the early 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire was a vast but deeply fragmented world divided among princes, bishops, free cities, and countless smaller lordships. Its political diversity was matched by religious uniformity. Western Christianity centered in Rome shaped daily life, law, education, and community identity. Yet beneath the surface, dissatisfaction was growing. Economic tensions, social pressures, and spiritual concerns mixed with long-standing complaints about corruption within the church. In this environment of uncertainty and hope, a movement would arise that transformed not only German-speaking lands, but much of Europe. The spark came from Martin Luther, a monk and scholar whose protests set off the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther was born in the late 15th century in Eisleben, a town in central Germany. He grew up in a society where the church played a central role in everything from local festivals to the administration of justice. After surviving a violent storm, an event that he interpreted as a sign, Luther entered a monastic order and devoted himself to study and prayer. He eventually became a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, where his deep engagement with Scripture shaped his understanding of faith. At this time, the church offered indulgences, documents that promised the reduction of time in purgatory. Although the exact theology surrounding indulgences was complex, many ordinary people understood them as a kind of spiritual transaction. a payment for forgiveness or salvation. The practice had existed for centuries, but abuses increased as church officials sought funds for large projects, including the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Agents such as Johann Tetzel gained notoriety for their aggressive sales techniques, creating resentment among both common people and educated clergy. Luther's growing concern over indulgences was not born from rebellion, but from a desire to reform what he saw as misguided practices. He believed that salvation came from faith alone, not from financial contributions or ritual acts. To open a scholarly debate, he wrote a series of statements outlining his objections and areas requiring discussion. Tradition holds that in the year spelled out 1517, he posted these statements, the 95 Theses, on the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. Whether or not the posting occurred exactly as later generations imagined, the thesis quickly circulated across the empire, aided by the growing use of the printing press. The printing press was a revolutionary force in early 16th century Europe. Books and pamphlets could now be produced faster and more cheaply than ever before. Luther's writings spread rapidly, reaching students, artisans, merchants, and nobles. His clear, direct language resonated with people who felt alienated by the Church's complex doctrines and distant leadership. His message that faith was a personal relationship with God, grounded in Scripture rather than mediated through elaborate rituals, appealed to many who desired a simpler, more authentic spirituality. Church authorities, however, saw Luther's writings as a direct challenge to their authority. As his audience grew, so did the pressure on him to recant. Debates followed, including a famous confrontation at Leipzig, where Luther argued openly that Scripture, not the Pope, held final authority. By making such a claim, he crossed a boundary that placed him outside the accepted teachings of the Church. In the years spelled out 1520, Pope Leo X issued a papal bull condemning many of Luther's ideas. Luther responded by publicly burning this document, an act that symbolized his break with Rome. The following year, he was summoned before the Diet of Worms, an imperial assembly called by Emperor Charles I. There Luther was asked to retract his writings. His refusal, summed up in words traditionally recalled as, "Here I stand," made him a symbol of defiance for supporters and a dangerous heretic in the eyes of his opponents. The emperor declared him an outlaw, but Luther found refuge under the protection of Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony. While hidden at Wartburg Castle, Luther began translating the Bible into German. This was more than a literary project. It was a cultural milestone. Although regional dialects varied widely, Luther's translation helped form a more unified written German language. His text was accessible, written in the kind of language ordinary people spoke, and its publication allowed individuals to read Scripture directly for the first time on a wide scale. This shift empowered laypeople, weakened clerical control, and supported the growth of new religious communities. The Reformation did not spread evenly or peacefully. Different regions of the empire adopted different responses. Some princes embraced Luther's ideas because they believed in the reform movement. Others saw political advantages. Adopting a new faith allowed them to assert independence from the emperor or claim church lands within their territories. Meanwhile, some cities experienced grassroots reform driven by preachers, guilds, and ordinary residents. The diversity of responses created tensions that soon erupted into violence. One of the earliest and most tragic outcomes was the Peasants' War in the early 1520s. Inspired partly by religious ideas and partly by long-standing social grievances, many peasants believed that Luther's call for Christian freedom justified demands for lower taxes, fewer feudal obligations, and greater rights. However, Luther opposed the revolt, insisting that spiritual freedom did not justify social rebellion. The uprising was crushed by armies loyal to the princes, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths. This event revealed the growing gap between the religious ideals of the Reformation and the complex social realities of the empire. Despite such turmoil, the Protestant movement continued to expand and evolve. Reformers like Philip Melanchthon helped organize Lutheran teachings into structured doctrines. Meanwhile, other figures such as Dietrich Zwingli in Zurich and later John Calvin in Geneva developed their own forms of Protestantism, differing from Lutheranism on points of theology and practice. These variations showed that the Reformation was not a single unified movement, but a broad transformation touching many aspects of life. The growing religious diversity within the Holy Roman Empire forced political leaders to confront a new reality. The old system in which a single church guided spiritual life across Europe had fractured. The Emperor Charles V sought to restore unity both for religious reasons and to maintain political stability. Yet he faced powerful obstacles. The empire's structure limited his authority, and many princes were determined to defend their newfound autonomy. These tensions led to a series of conflicts, alliances, and negotiations. The most important outcome in this early phase was the Peace of Augsburg, agreed upon in the year spelled out 1555. This settlement allowed each prince within the empire to choose the religion of his territory, either Lutheranism or Catholicism, under the principle known as whose realm his religion. While limited in its scope and excluding several Protestant movements, the agreement marked a major shift. Unity was no longer enforced. Instead, diversity became an accepted, if uneasy, reality. The Peace of Augsburg provided temporary stability, but it did not resolve the deeper issues. Disputes continued over the rights of religious minorities, the political ambitions of princes, and the limitations of imperial authority. The settlement did not anticipate the rise of other Protestant traditions, nor did it address the growing influence of Calvinism in cities and regions across the empire. These unresolved tensions created a fragile balance that would later collapse into one of the most devastating conflicts in European history. The cultural impact of the Reformation reached far beyond politics. Literacy increased as people sought to read scripture in their own language. Printing houses flourished, producing not only religious texts but pamphlets, songs, and educational materials. Schools expanded as both Protestant and Catholic leaders recognized the importance of teaching, reading, and doctrine. Families experienced changes as well, with a greater emphasis on personal faith. The role of the household in religious instruction, and the importance of marriage and family life among clergy. Art and music also changed. Protestant regions developed new forms of religious music, encouraging congregational singing. Sermons became central to worship, expanding the role of the spoken word. Meanwhile, Catholic regions responded with renewed artistic and architectural efforts, promoting an emotional and visual form of devotion. These contrasts contributed to a rich and diverse cultural landscape within German-speaking lands. The Reformation reshaped identity. People no longer defined themselves solely by local or imperial affiliations. Their religious beliefs became deeply tied to their sense of belonging. In many places, being Lutheran or Catholic became part of everyday social and political life. Neighboring towns might follow different confessions, creating boundaries that cut across traditional regions. These divisions did not erase older loyalties, but they added a new and powerful layer to the complexity of the empire. By the early 17th century, the Holy Roman Empire had become a vast checkerboard of religious and political divisions. Lutheran territories stood beside Catholic ones, while Calvinist regions had grown despite lacking legal recognition under the Peace of Augsburg. Princes maneuvered for greater autonomy, cities defended their privileges, and the emperor struggled to maintain cohesion in a realm where local loyalties often outweighed imperial unity. These unresolved tensions created an atmosphere in which even small disputes could escalate into larger confrontations. When conflict finally erupted, it spiraled into one of the most destructive wars in European history, the 30 Years' War. The spark came from a region long known for its political complexity, the Kingdom of Bohemia. Bohemia was a diverse land with a strong tradition of religious independence, influenced by earlier reform movements, such as those inspired by John H. Many of its nobles leaned toward Protestantism. However, the Habsburg family, which held the imperial crown, sought to strengthen Catholic authority in the region. When Ferdinand of Styria, later Emperor Ferdinand II, became King of Bohemia, he pushed for stricter enforcement of Catholicism. Tensions mounted as Protestant nobles feared suppression. Their anxiety reached a breaking point in an event known as the Defenestration of Prague, when a group of nobles confronted imperial officials in Prague Castle and threw them out of a high window. Remarkably, the officials survived, landing in a pile of soft material outside. This dramatic act became the symbol of rebellion as Bohemian leaders declared Ferdinand deposed and elected Frederick of the Palatinate as their king. This challenge threatened Habsburg authority, and Ferdinand responded with military force. The conflict first appeared as a localized rebellion, but the political and religious stakes invited wider intervention. Protestant princes feared that a Habsburg victory would roll back their freedoms. Catholic leaders saw the revolt as a dangerous precedent. In a short time, allies on both sides entered the struggle, expanding the Bohemian conflict into a broader imperial war. The first major battle at White Mountain resulted in a decisive victory for the imperial and Catholic forces. Frederick fled, earning the nickname the Winter King for his brief rule. Bohemian resistance collapsed, and harsh retribution followed. Protestant nobles were executed, exiled or stripped of their lands. Catholicism was enforced with new intensity. This initial phase marked the beginning of a long and devastating struggle that would engulf much of the empire. As the conflict widened, it took on new dimensions. The war became not only a religious confrontation, but a struggle over political power and territorial control. The empire fractured further as various states pursued their own interests. Some Protestant princes resisted the emperor's authority. Others supported him in exchange for privileges. The shifting alliances made the war unpredictable, turning the empire into a battlefield for competing agendas. The second major phase of the conflict began when Denmark, under its king Christian IV, intervened in support of Protestant interests. Denmark had long-standing political ambitions in northern Germany, and Christian sought to expand his influence. However, his campaign met strong resistance from imperial forces led by skilled commanders such as Count Tilly and Ulrich von Wallenstein. Wallenstein, a wealthy noble from Bohemia, assembled a formidable army financed by his own resources and the spoils of war. His rise showed how private military power had become a force capable of shaping imperial politics. Danish forces suffered defeat, leading to the Edict of Restitution issued by Emperor Ferdinand II. This decree aimed to restore Catholic control over lands that had been secularized since the mid-16th century, strengthening imperial authority at the expense of Protestant rulers. Instead of stabilizing the empire, however, the edict deepened resentment and contributed to further escalation. A new turning point came with the entrance of Sweden into the war. Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden, was a brilliant military leader with a modernized army. He sought to protect Protestant interests and weakened Habsburg influence in the Baltic region. Swedish forces landed in northern Germany and quickly gained support from Protestant states. Alarmed by the harsh policies of the emperor, Gustavus Adolphus achieved a series of victories that astonished contemporaries. His use of coordinated infantry, cavalry, and artillery marked a significant advance in military tactics. At the Battle of Breitenfeld, Swedish and Allied forces defeated the imperial army, providing new hope to the Protestant cause. His campaigns pushed deep into southern Germany, altering the balance of power. Yet, Gustavus Adolphus's triumphs were short-lived. He died in battle at Lutzen, another intense confrontation with imperial forces. Although the Swedes claimed the field, the loss of their king weakened the Protestant alliance. Internal disagreements and shifting priorities among the German princes further complicated the situation. Still, Sweden remained a major player, and continued to exert military pressure for years. Just when it seemed the empire could not endure further turmoil, France entered the conflict. France was a Catholic nation, but its leaders, particularly Cardinal Richelieu, feared growing Habsburg dominance in Europe. To prevent encirclement by Habsburg territories in both Spain and the Empire, France supported the Protestant cause strategically. French involvement transformed the war from a primarily religious conflict into a continental power struggle. The entry of France extended the war's duration and devastation. Armies marched across the empire, plundering villages, burning fields, and spreading disease. Soldiers often lived off the land, taking what they needed and leaving widespread destruction. Civilians bore the heaviest burden, facing hunger, displacement, and violence. Entire regions saw their populations fall dramatically, not only from direct conflict, but from famine and epidemics that followed. The economic impact was severe. Trade routes collapsed, agriculture declined, and many towns suffered catastrophic losses. Records from the time describe once thriving communities reduced to ruins. Travelers wrote of abandoned villages, overgrown fields, and empty churches. The psychological toll was immense as well. Survivors carried memories of fear, uncertainty, and loss that shaped the culture of the region long after the war ended. Despite the chaos, diplomacy eventually took precedence. After decades of fighting, exhaustion grew on all sides. Negotiations began in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück. Delegates from across Europe gathered to resolve not only the internal disputes of the empire, but the wider balance of power in the continent. The talks were lengthy and complex, involving dozens of states with competing demands. The Peace of Westphalia, concluded in the mid-7th century, reshaped the political map of Europe within the Holy Roman Empire. The settlement affirmed the principle established earlier in the Peace of Augsburg, allowing rulers to choose the religion of their territories. Crucially, it extended recognition to Calvinist states, acknowledging the religious diversity that had long existed in practice. The emperor's authority was further limited as princes gained legal standing to conduct diplomacy and form alliances, provided they did not threaten the empire as a whole. This new political structure transformed the empire into a federation of semi-independent states rather than a centralized monarchy. It did not end conflict entirely, but it provided a framework that reduced the chances of another large-scale religious war. The settlement also introduced diplomatic practices that influenced future international relations. Ideas such as state sovereignty and non-inference became guiding principles in European politics. In the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, the Holy Roman Empire survived, but only as a weakened federation of hundreds of principalities, duchies, bishops, and free cities. The Peace of Westphalia had confirmed the autonomy of these states, and imperial authority remained limited. Within this fragmented landscape, two rising powers, Austria and Brandenburg Prussia, began to shape the future of German-speaking Europe. Their rivalry would define the political landscape of the next centuries and lay the groundwork for the dramatic struggles that followed. The Habsburgs of Austria emerged from the war with strengthened control over their hereditary lands. Although they failed to centralize the wider empire, the Austrian rulers preserved strong authority in regions such as Bohemia, Hungary, and parts of northern Italy. Their monarchy grew increasingly cosmopolitan, ruling over a patchwork of peoples and cultures spread across Central and Southeastern Europe. Vienna became the center of this sprawling monarchy, known for its imperial court, its diplomacy, and its strategic position between Western Europe, the Italian states, and the Ottoman Empire. While Austria consolidated its influence, Brandenburg, Prussia underwent a transformation that would lift it from relative obscurity to major power. The lands that formed this emerging state were geographically scattered and internally diverse. Brandenburg lay within the empire, centered on Berlin and the surrounding regions. Prussia, however, existed outside the empire's legal structure, lying to the northeast along the Baltic coast. For much of their early history, These territories struggled with poverty, limited resources, and the destruction caused by repeated wars. The turning point in Prussian development came under the leadership of Frederick William, known to history as the Great Elector. He inherited his position in the mid-7th century when war had devastated the region. Recognizing the need for strong leadership, he set out to rebuild his territories through military discipline, administrative reform, and economic modernization. Frederick William created a standing army that became the backbone of Prussian power, financed through efficient taxation and supported by cooperation with the nobles known as Junkers. These nobles received privileges in exchange for military service and loyalty, forging an alliance that shaped Prussian society for generations. Frederick William also encouraged immigration, especially from skilled workers fleeing religious persecution in other parts of Europe. As artisans, merchants, and farmers arrived, they contributed to economic recovery and cultural diversity. The Great Elector strengthened trade networks and promoted urban development, helping to lift Prussia from the ruins of war into a more stable and organized realm. By the time of his death, Brandenburg Prussia had become a recognized force, even if not yet equal to Austria. The next major step came under Frederick III, who became king in Prussia and thereafter was known as Frederick III. By obtaining royal status, he raised the prestige of his state. Although this title applied only to the Prussian lands outside the empire, it signaled rising ambition. The creation of a Prussian monarchy established a clearer identity for a state that had once been overshadowed by its neighbors. The real architect of Prussia's rise, however, was Frederick William I, often called the Soldier King. He devoted himself to military efficiency, transforming the Prussian army into one of the most disciplined forces in Europe. His reign emphasized simplicity, frugality, and administrative precision. Under his rule, military service became a defining feature of Prussian society. Drill, organization, and discipline were elevated to high cultural values, shaping the character of both the army and the state. Although the Soldier King avoided major wars, he left behind a powerful military machine ready for future expansion. This foundation prepared the way for his son Frederick II, known to history as Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was one of the most influential figures in 18th century Europe. Educated in the ideas of the Enlightenment, he wrote essays on philosophy, corresponded with thinkers such as Voltaire, and appreciated the arts. Yet he combined this intellectual curiosity with ambitious military leadership. Early in his reign, he launched daring campaigns to seize Silesia from Austria, a region rich in resources and strategically important. These conflicts, known as the Scythian Wars, triggered a broader struggle between Prussia and Austria for dominance in Central Europe. The rivalry drew in other major powers, including France, Britain, and Russia, reflecting shifting alliances and the complex balance of power on the continent. The resulting conflict, often called the 7 Years' War, extended far beyond Europe and involved fighting in North America, India, and the Caribbean. Within the German lands, however, the core issue remained the struggle between the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns. Frederick the Great faced overwhelming odds, with Austria, France, and Russia united against him. Yet his strategic skill, rapid maneuvering, and willingness to take risks kept Prussia in the fight. At key moments, fortune intervened. The sudden death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth brought a pro-Russian ruler to the Russian throne, providing relief at a critical moment. By the end of the conflict, Prussia emerged battered but victorious, retaining control of Scythia and gaining recognition as one of Europe's great powers. Austria, though unable to reclaim Scythia, remained a major force. Empress Maria Theresa initiated important reforms, strengthening the administration, reorganizing the army, and improving the tax system. Her efforts modernized the Habsburg lands and prepared the state for continued influence. Along with her son, Emperor Joseph II, she implemented Enlightenment-inspired changes that reshaped education, religious policy, and legal structures. These reforms did not eliminate internal diversity, but they strengthened central authority and made the Austrian monarchy more resilient. The rise of Prussia and the continued strength of Austria created a dual leadership within German-speaking Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, still formally intact, became increasingly symbolic as real power rested with these two states. The emperor, traditionally drawn from the Habsburg family, presided over a loose federation in which many princes acted independently. Imperial institutions persisted, but their influence diminished, especially as Prussia asserted itself outside the traditional structures. Meanwhile, cultural life in German lands flourished. The 18th century was a period of intellectual brilliance, marked by the Enlightenment and the flowering of literature, philosophy, and music. Thinkers such as Immanuel Kant, based in the Prussian city of Königsberg, explored questions of reason, morality, and human understanding. Poets and playwrights, including Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Friedrich Schiller, shaped a new era of German culture. In music, composers such as Johann Sebastian Bach, George Friedrich Handel, and later Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart contributed to a tradition that would profoundly influence European art. This cultural vibrancy contrasted with the political fragmentation that continued to define the empire. Local identities remained strong. Bavaria, Saxony, Bavaria, and other states maintained their own courts, armies, and traditions. Free imperial cities such as Frankfurt, Nuremberg, and Hamburg operated with considerable autonomy, driven by trade and civic life. Each region contributed its own customs and innovations to the broader German world. By the closing years of the 18th century, German-speaking Europe found itself at a crossroads. The rivalry between Austria and Prussia had shaped political life, while cultural and intellectual currents from the Enlightenment were reshaping how people thought about society, governance, and individual rights. Yet the structure of the Holy Roman Empire remained deeply traditional, with hundreds of states, large and small, linked together by ancient customs and legal ties. This delicate balance would be shattered by the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The transformation that followed would sweep away old institutions, redraw borders, and lay the foundations for modern Germany. The French Revolution, beginning in the late 18th century, sent shockwaves across Europe. Its ideas of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty challenged the established order of monarchies and aristocracies. While some German thinkers admired the early phase of the revolution, the violence that followed, particularly the execution of the French king, worried rulers throughout the continent. Austria and Prussia, both powerful monarchies, joined coalitions aimed at containing or reversing the revolutionary tide. Despite their initial confidence, the German powers soon encountered a new and formidable force. The revolutionary French army, energized by ideology and reorganized to fight with unprecedented mobility. Early French victories alarmed Europe, but few expected what would come next. As internal chaos in France gave way to the rise of a strong leader, the conflict took on an entirely new character. Napoleon Bonaparte, a general of extraordinary ambition and talent, emerged from the turmoil to reshape French politics and the European landscape. When he became first consul and later emperor, he transformed France into a central power capable of projecting military force across the continent. His ambition was not merely to defend France, but to dominate Europe and reorganize it according to his vision. The German states, fragmented and divided, offered little unified resistance. Many rulers feared Napoleon, but also saw opportunities in the shifting political environment. Others underestimated the scale of the coming transformation. As French armies swept through Europe, they confronted and defeated Austria and Prussia in a series of rapid and decisive campaigns. These victories exposed the weaknesses of both states. Prussia, for instance, suffered a humiliating defeat at the battles of Jena and Auret, revealing deep inefficiencies in its military and administration. Napoleon's intentions for the German lands went far beyond military conquest. He sought to reorganize Central Europe, in ways that would strengthen his own position while weakening the traditional structures of the Holy Roman Empire. To achieve this, he dismantled the old system of imperial cities and ecclesiastical territories. Many church lands were secularized and smaller states were absorbed into larger ones. This process, known as mediatization, reduced the number of states within the empire and concentrated political power in fewer hands. One of Napoleon's most significant creations was the Confederation of the Rhine, composed of many German states that pledged loyalty to him. This confederation served as a buffer between France and its rivals. In effect, it removed these states from the Holy Roman Empire's authority, further undermining the imperial structure. With much of the empire now aligned with France, the institution that had existed for centuries was nearing its end. The decisive moment came when Emperor Francis II abdicated his imperial title. Faced with the reality that the empire existed largely in name, he dissolved the Holy Roman Empire entirely. The institution that had begun with a coronation in the early Middle Ages came to a quiet end under pressure from Napoleon's sweeping reforms. In its place, Francis adopted the title Emperor of Austria, symbolizing the shift of Habsburg identity away from imperial universalism and toward a more defined national monarchy. The fall of the Holy Roman Empire was a profound moment in German history. For nearly a millennium, the empire had served as the political framework, imperfect, fragmented, yet deeply influential, within which German identity had developed. Its disappearance left a vacuum that would not be filled instantly. Instead, the German lands entered a period of experimentation, reform, and shifting alliances. Napoleon's influence was not limited to political boundaries. He introduced widespread administrative and legal reforms inspired by French models. The Napoleonic Code, with its emphasis on equality before the law and the abolition of feudal privileges, became the foundation of modern legal systems in many regions. While these changes sometimes disrupted traditional practices, they also introduced principles of efficiency, uniformity, and modernization that appealed to reform-minded leaders. Education, taxation, and civil administration underwent significant changes as well. Guild restrictions weakened, allowing greater economic freedom. Jewish communities in several regions gained civil rights that had long been denied. The influence of Enlightenment ideals already present in German intellectual life was strengthened through compulsory schooling, legal standardization, and the promotion of merit-based government positions. The impact of the Napoleonic era varied across the German states. In some places, such as the Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by Napoleon's brother Jerome, reforms were implemented enthusiastically but without deep local support. In others, modernization efforts took root more organically. Prussia, humiliated by defeat, embarked on a comprehensive program of reform that would reshape its future. Leaders such as Baron von Stein and Karl August von Hardenberg introduced sweeping changes, ending serfdom, reorganizing local government, and modernizing the army. These reforms laid the foundation for a more efficient and centralized state, preparing Prussia for a renewed role in German and European affairs. Meanwhile, Austria grappled with the loss of its traditional influence. Although weakened by defeat, the Austrian monarchy retained control over its diverse lands and continued to serve as a major power in European diplomacy. The Habsburgs worked to restore stability and suppress revolutionary ideas while also implementing select reforms to strengthen their administration. Despite Napoleon's apparent dominance, resistance to French rule grew. Many Germans admired certain aspects of the French reforms, but resented foreign control and the burdens of military conscription. Cultural nationalism began to take shape, inspired by writers and thinkers who emphasized the uniqueness of the German language, folklore, and history. Figures such as Johann Gottfried Herder and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe contributed to a growing sense of shared identity, even as political unity remained distant. This rising nationalism became a powerful force during the Wars of Liberation. As Napoleon's empire stretched across Europe, cracks began to appear. The failed invasion of Russia weakened French forces, emboldening German resistance. Prussian reformers and military leaders called for popular mobilization, urging citizens to defend their homeland. Volunteers joined the struggle, and uprising spread. Austria too re-entered the conflict, aligning with Russia and Britain against Napoleon. The decisive confrontations took place across German soil. The Battle of Leipzig, often called the Battle of the Nations, was a turning point. Allied armies from Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden joined forces to defeat Napoleon's troops. The scale of the battle, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers engaged, made it one of the largest conflicts of the era. Napoleon's defeat at Leipzig forced him to retreat westward and ultimately led to his abdication. The defeat of Napoleon and the decisions made at the Congress of Vienna reshaped the German lands, but they did not resolve the deeper questions that had been growing since the Enlightenment. What should Germany be? Who should govern it? And what should govern it? And what values should shape its future? The German Confederation, created after Napoleon's fall, preserved the old political order by maintaining the power of princes and ensuring Austrian leadership. Yet beneath this surface of stability, new intellectual, cultural, and economic forces were emerging, forces that would challenge the traditional structures of authority and push the German states toward political change. One of the most transformative developments of this era was the rise of nationalism. Unlike earlier forms of loyalty based on local identity or allegiance to a ruling dynasty, 19th century nationalism rooted itself in language, shared culture, and the idea of a collective people. German poets, historians, and philosophers played a crucial role in shaping this new consciousness. Johann Gottfried Herder had argued in the previous century that each nation possessed a unique spirit expressed through its language, traditions, and folk culture. His ideas resonated deeply in a fragmented land where hundreds of states existed, side by side. Writers such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Friedrich Schiller celebrated themes of freedom, individuality, and moral responsibility, inspiring readers across social classes. Meanwhile, scholars like the Brothers Grimm collected folktales and linguistic evidence that highlighted the cultural unity of German-speaking peoples. These works helped people imagine themselves as part of a broader community that transcended political borders. Economic changes reinforced these cultural shifts. The early Industrial Revolution reached German lands unevenly, but with growing impact. Textile mills, iron works, and coal mines expanded, particularly in regions such as the Rhineland and Saxony. New transportation systems, including roads, canals, and eventually railways, linked towns and markets, reducing the isolation that had characterized earlier centuries. As trade grew, so did the need for economic cooperation among states. Prussia took the lead in forming the Zollverein, a customs union that eliminated internal tariffs among participating states. The Zollverein fostered economic growth, encouraged industrial development, and strengthened trade networks. It also subtly advanced Prussian influence, since Austria, unwilling to abandon its protectionist policies, remained outside the Union. Over time, the Zollverein created a sense of shared economic purpose that many began to interpret as a step toward political unity. These cultural and economic transformations produced new social groups. A growing middle class of teachers, merchants, lawyers, and civil servants became increasingly vocal in public life. They read political writings, attended lectures, and participated in literary societies. Many believed in constitutional government, civil rights, and national unity, principles that clashed with the conservative order created at the Congress of Vienna. The German Confederation, dominated by Austria, and to a lesser extent by Prussia, sought to suppress these liberal and nationalist movements. Princes feared that demands for constitutional rights would undermine their authority, while Austria, with its multi-thick empire, worried that nationalist ideas could inspire unrest among its ideas. To maintain control, the authorities passed restrictive laws known as the Carlsbad Decrees. These measures targeted universities, newspapers, and political clubs, seeking to silence the rising voices of reform. Despite government repression, discontent continued to grow. The hardships caused by economic downturns, crop failures, and food shortages intensified public anger. Industrial workers, artisans, and small farmers faced uncertainty and competition. Meanwhile, urban growth created new social tensions as people moved from rural villages to factory towns. The traditional structures of society were strained in ways unseen before. By the mid-9th century, the combination of political repression, economic hardship, and rising nationalist sentiment had created a volatile situation. It was within this atmosphere that revolution erupted, first in France and soon after across the German states. The revolutionary wave of 1848 began with uprisings in Paris. When news of the French revolt reached German lands, it inspired demonstrations, petitions, and demands for reform. Crowds gathered in cities such as Vienna, Berlin, Frankfurt, and Munich, calling for constitutions, freer press laws, expanded voting rights, and national unity. Many rulers, caught off guard by the scale of the protests, initially responded with concessions, hoping to calm the situation. In many states, constitutional assemblies were convened, political prisoners were released, censorship relaxed. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the dream of a unified liberal Germany might finally be within reach. The center of this movement became the city of Frankfurt, where delegates from across the German Confederation assembled in the Paulskirche, or St. Paul's Church, to draft a constitution for a unified German nation. This assembly, known simply as the Frankfurt Parliament, brought together lawyers, professors, judges, merchants, and journalists. Men who represented the educated middle class, but not necessarily the broader population. Their task was historic: to craft the first modern constitution for Germany. Debates within the Frankfurt Parliament were intense and often divided. Delegates agreed on basic principles such as civil liberties and the rule of law, but disagreements quickly emerged regarding the structure of the state. Some argued for a federal monarchy with strong regional autonomy, while others supported a centralized government. A major question concerned Austria. Should a united Germany include the vast territories of the Austrian Empire, many of which were not German-speaking? This became known as the conflict between Greater Germany, including Austria, and Little Germany, excluding Austria. Another key issue centered on who should lead the new nation. Many delegates favored offering the German imperial crown to the Prussian king, Frederick William IV. Prussia was the largest and most powerful German state outside Austria, and its military strength seemed essential for defending a unified nation. Yet when the crown was formally offered to him, Frederick William IV refused, declaring that he would not accept a crown from the gutter, meaning a crown granted by a popular assembly rather than by fellow monarchs. This refusal dealt a devastating blow to the Frankfurt Parliament. Without support from Prussia or Austria, the Parliament lacked the power to enforce its constitution. Conservative forces regained strength, and rulers who had earlier conceded reforms began to reverse them. Troops loyal to the princes crushed uprisings in several cities. One by one, the revolutionary governments collapsed. By the end of this turbulent year, the dreams of 1848 had faded. The Frankfurt Parliament dissolved, unable to implement its vision. Many reformers went into exile or returned to private life, while conservative regimes reasserted control across the German states. The German Confederation remained intact, and the old order appeared restored. Yet the revolutions of 1848 were not without lasting impact. They demonstrated the widespread desire for national unity and constitutional government, even if those goals remained unrealized at the time. The debates held in Frankfurt shaped later political thinking, and many future leaders, including younger figures in Prussia and Austria, studied the failures of the revolution carefully. The revolutions also revealed the importance of strong leadership and military power in achieving unity. an insight that would influence the events to come. Economic and social changes continued after 1848. Regardless of political setbacks, industrial growth accelerated. Railroads expanded, linking distant regions and facilitating trade. Urban centers grew larger and more complex. These developments strengthened the sense of shared identity among German-speaking peoples. Meanwhile, Prussia implemented further reforms in administration, education, and military organization, gradually positioning itself as a more modern and capable state. The failure of the revolutions of 1848 left the German-speaking lands politically fragmented and ideologically divided. The hopes for democratic unity faded, but the dream itself did not disappear. Instead, it shifted from the hands of idealistic revolutionaries to the strategies of powerful statesmen. In the emerging landscape of the mid-9th century, no figure would shape German destiny more profoundly than Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian statesman whose mixture of realism, diplomacy, and force transformed the German world. Through a series of calculated moves, what he famously called blood and iron, Bismarck steered Prussia toward dominance and forged a unified German empire under Prussian leadership. Before Bismarck entered the political stage, Prussia had already begun to modernize. The humiliation suffered during the Napoleonic era pushed its rulers to reform the army, administration, and education. These reforms created a more centralized and efficient state, capable of mobilizing resources rapidly and effectively. Meanwhile, the Zollverein, the customs union led by Prussia, continued to expand. Its growing network drew many German states into economic cooperation with Prussia, enhancing its influence while isolating Austria. Austria, for its part, faced ongoing internal pressures. Its diverse empire, stretching across Central and Southeastern Europe, required immense resources to govern and defend. Rising nationalism among Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, and other peoples strained the Habsburg monarchy. These challenges made Austria less able to exert strong leadership within the German Confederation. This imbalance created an opportunity for Prussia to rise. In this context, Otto von Bismarck emerged as the key architect of German unification. Born into a Prussian noble family, Bismarck entered politics with a reputation for strong conservative views and fierce loyalty to the monarchy. Before becoming minister-president, he served as ambassador in Russia and later in France. Diplomatic posts gave him keen insight into European politics and the motivations of other great powers. When King Wilhelm I appointed Bismarck as minister-president, Prussia was embroiled in a constitutional conflict. The parliament, dominated by liberals, sought to limit military spending and assert greater control over government policy. Bismarck responded with a bold interpretation of the constitution, arguing that when Parliament and the Crown disagreed, the government could continue to function based on past budgets. This stance provoked outrage among liberals, but it allowed Bismarck to strengthen the army, an essential step in his larger plan. Bismarck did not support the liberal dream of unity through parliamentary debate. Instead, he believed Germany could be unified only through decisive action, shaped by power, diplomacy, and military strength. He later summarized this approach by stating that major political questions of the age would be settled not by speeches and votes, but by blood and iron. Though often misunderstood as a call for endless violence, this phrase reflected Bismarck's belief in using force only when necessary and always in combination with diplomacy. His strategy unfolded in 3 major conflicts, each designed to isolate Austria, neutralize rivals, and rally German states behind Prussia. The first test came in the conflict with Denmark over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. These territories contained mixed populations of German and Danish speakers and had long been a source of tension. When the Danish king attempted to absorb the duchies fully into his kingdom, German nationalists protested. Bismarck seized the opportunity. He persuaded Austria to join Prussia in military action, presenting their intervention as a joint effort to defend German interests. Prussian and Austrian forces quickly defeated Denmark. The duchies were placed under joint Administration: Schleswig under Prussia and Holstein under Austria. At first glance, the arrangement seemed cooperative, but Bismarck designed it to create friction. Conflicting administrative priorities and disputes over governance soon emerged, giving Bismarck the pretext he needed for the next phase of his plan. The second major conflict was the Austrian War, a short but decisive confrontation that reshaped the political landscape of Central Europe. Bismarck carefully prepared for this war by securing diplomatic neutrality from Russia and France. He also avoided provoking Britain, which preferred a balance of power on the continent. With Austria diplomatically isolated, Bismarck waited for a suitable moment to strike. Tensions over the administration of Holstein provided that moment. Prussia moved troops into regions Austria claimed to control, and hostilities escalated. Many German states sided with Austria, fearing Prussian dominance. Yet Prussia's modernized army, equipped with rapid-firing rifles and supported by efficient railway logistics, achieved swift victories. The decisive battle near Königgrätz demonstrated Prussia's military superiority. Bismarck opposed harsh punishment for Austria. He believed future cooperation between Austria and a unified Germany might be necessary and did not want to create lasting bitterness. The resulting peace agreement expelled Austria from German affairs and dissolved the old German Confederation. In its place, Prussia established the North German Confederation, a new political structure that united many northern German states under Prussian leadership. Although this confederation had a parliament, real power rested with Bismarck and King Wilhelm I. The third and final stage of unification involved the Franco-Russian War. Bismarck understood that the southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and others, remained wary of Prussian Natural, they shared cultural ties with the north, but maintained strong regional identities and independent rulers. Bismarck calculated that only a common external threat could bring them fully into a unified German state. The opportunity arose when Spain sought a new monarch and a Prussian prince became a possible candidate. France under Emperor Napoleon III feared encirclement by Prussian influence. French officials demanded assurances that the Prussian royal family would not take the Spanish throne. King Wilhelm I politely agreed to withdraw the candidate, but tension remained. Bismarck cleverly manipulated a diplomatic message known as the Ems Dispatch. By editing the king's account of the meeting with the French ambassador, he made the exchange appear more confrontational than it had been. When the edited version was published, it outraged French public opinion. Napoleon III declared war on Prussia, believing a swift victory would strengthen his weakening regime. Instead, French forces were defeated with remarkable speed. Prussia's military efficiency, combined with the support of the southern German states, turned the conflict into a decisive victory. At the Battle of Sedan, the French emperor himself was captured. Paris fell soon after, and the war ended with France forced to pay a large indemnity and surrender territory, including Alsace and parts of Rhine. The triumph over France achieved what Bismarck had long sought: German unity. In a symbolic ceremony held in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, King Wilhelm I was proclaimed German emperor. This moment marked the birth of the German Empire, a new nation-state dominated by Prussia and forged through a combination of diplomacy, military strategy, and calculated political pressure. The new empire brought together a diverse collection of states. Under a federal structure, Prussia remained the largest and most influential, controlling a significant portion of the territory and population. The emperor and Bismarck, now imperial chancellor, held substantial power. Yet the empire also included a parliament elected by universal male suffrage, giving ordinary citizens a greater voice than in many other European monarchies. The unification of Germany under Prussian leadership in the early 1870s transformed Central Europe, a land that had long been divided into dozens of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities, had suddenly become one of the largest and most powerful states on the continent. The new empire, known as the Kaiserreich, was born in the glittering Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. but its real foundation rested on decades of industrial growth, military discipline, and political calculation. In the years that followed, Germany experienced rapid transformation, becoming a major industrial and scientific center, a rising global power, and a society filled with both possibility and tension. At the head of the new empire stood Emperor Wilhelm I, a traditional monarch who relied heavily on his chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Although Bismarck had united Germany through war and diplomacy, his priorities after unification shifted dramatically. He now saw peace, stability, and internal consolidation as essential. War had built the empire, peace would sustain it. One of Bismarck's first concerns was managing the empire's political structure. The Kaiserreich was designed as a federal state, with individual kingdoms such as Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg retaining certain privileges. Yet real power lay with Prussia, whose king served as emperor and whose ministers dominated the national government. The Reichstag, a parliament elected by universal male suffrage, held the power to approve budgets, but could not remove the chancellor or the emperor. This mixture of democratic forms and authoritarian authoritin, we created a system that was both modern and deeply conservative. Despite its political complexities, the German Empire entered a period of extraordinary economic growth. Industrialization accelerated rapidly, especially in regions rich in coal and iron ore, such as the Ruhr and the Saar. New factories produced steel, chemicals, locomotives, electrical equipment, and textiles. German companies like Siemens, CRO, and BSF became international leaders in engineering and scientific innovation. Advances in chemistry led to breakthroughs in dyes, pharmaceuticals, and fertilizers, turning Germany into a world center of scientific research. Railway lines expanded across the empire, connecting cities, moving raw materials, and enabling goods to reach global markets. Urban centers such as Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, and Cologne grew at remarkable speeds. Berlin, once a provincial capital, developed into a major European metropolis filled with factories, universities, theaters, and government buildings. The growth of industry drew millions of people from rural areas into the cities, reshaping social life and creating new opportunities and new tensions. The expansion of industrial society gave rise to a large working class. Factory laborers faced long hours, low wages, and unsafe working conditions. These hardships spurred the development of labor movements and political organizations. The Social Democratic Party, known as the SPD, emerged as a powerful voice for workers' rights, advocating for social reform, political participation, and improved living conditions. It quickly became one of the largest socialist parties in Europe. Bismarck viewed the SPD with deep suspicion. He feared that socialist ideology, rooted in class struggle and international solidarity, threatened the stability of the empire and the authority of the monarchy. In response, he introduced the anti-socialist laws which ban socialist meetings, publications, and organizations. Yet, even as he attempted to suppress socialism, Bismarck also introduced pioneering social welfare programs designed to address workers' needs and reduce support for the SPD. These reforms included health insurance, accident insurance, disability protection, and old age pensions. Although limited in their early form, they marked the beginning of a modern welfare state. Bismarck believed that if the government took responsibility for workers' well-being, they would feel more loyal to the empire and less drawn to socialist agitation. His calculation was partly successful. The SPD survived repression and continued to grow, but millions of workers benefited from new protections that shaped German society. While domestic politics occupied Bismarck's attention, foreign affairs remained central to his vision. He sought to preserve the balance of power in Europe and prevent any coalition from forming against Germany. To achieve this, he constructed a complex system of alliances, treating diplomacy as a careful game of strategy. His primary goals were to avoid conflict with France, which remained resentful after losing Alsace and parts of Rhine, and to maintain good relations with Russia and Austria. Bismarck's diplomacy achieved stability for many years, but it relied heavily on his personal skill. He avoided colonial expansion, believing it would distract from European security and create unnecessary conflict. Yet this cautious approach soon collided with the ambitions of a new generation of leaders. When Emperor Wilhelm I died, he was succeeded briefly by his son Friedrich III, and then by his grandson Wilhelm II, was energetic, impatient, and determined to place his personal stamp on the empire. He admired the military and believed Germany deserved greater recognition on the world stage. This ambition brought dramatic wages stops. Now, Wilhelm II's first major actions was to dismiss Bismarck. The Chancellor, now aging and increasingly at odds with the young emperor, found himself unable to maintain his influence. After decades of shaping German and European politics, he retired from public life. His departure marked the end of an era. Under Wilhelm II, German foreign policy shifted toward a more assertive and expansionary direction, what the emperor described as Politik or world policy. Germany began to build a navy intended to rival Britain's, sparking a naval arms race that heightened international tension. German leaders sought colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Though these territories never matched the size or wealth of British or French possessions, Germany's new ambitions alarmed European powers who feared the emergence of a dominant and unpredictable rival. Domestically, Wilhelm II presided over a society that was increasingly modern, educated, and diverse. The arts flourished, universities expanded, and scientific research advanced rapidly. New forms of entertainment, music halls, cafes, illustrated newspapers, and department stores transformed urban life. Yet beneath this vibrancy lay social and political strains. Workers demanded better wages and safer conditions. The middle class sought greater political participation. Religious divisions persisted, particularly between the largely Catholic regions of the South and West and the Protestant majority in Prussia. Bismarck had earlier waged the culture conflict with the Catholic Church in an attempt to reduce its influence. Although he later backed away from this campaign, the tensions it created continued to shape political alignments. Agrarian interests, especially in eastern Prussia, feared losing influence to industrial and urban groups. Conservatives worried that rapid modernization would erode traditional values. Nationalist students and intellectuals argued that Germany needed a stronger global presence and a more aggressive foreign policy. These differing visions created a political landscape filled with competing pressures. The empire's military strength remained a central pillar of national identity. Service in the army was a rite of passage for many young men, and military values permeated education, government, and public culture. The prestige of the officer corps and the influence of military planning shaped political decisions in ways that often overshadowed civilian authority. As the 20th century opened, the German Empire stood at the height of its power. Its industries were booming, its population was growing, and its universities and laboratories were at the forefront of scientific discovery. Yet beneath this impressive exterior, there were tensions, political, social, and international, that would soon push the nation into one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. The First World War would test Germany as never before, revealing both the strength and the fragility of the empire created by Bismarck. By the war's end, the Kaiserreich would collapse, leaving Germany with deep scars and a troubled path ahead. The origins of the First World War were complex, but they grew from long-standing rivalries between the major European powers. Germany's rapid rise had altered the balance of power, alarming nations like France and Britain. France sought to regain Alsace and the parts of Rhine lost in the Franco-Russian War. Britain viewed Germany's growing navy as a threat to its maritime dominance. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary faced nationalist tensions within its diverse empire and relied heavily on Germany for support. Europe had divided into two major alliance blocs: the Triple Entente composed of France, Britain, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance consisting of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Though Italy's commitment was uncertain, the spark that ignited this volatile situation occurred in southeastern Europe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, by a Serbian nationalist, created a diplomatic crisis. Austria-Hungary, supported by Germany, issued demands to Serbia. When Serbia's response failed to satisfy Vienna, Austria-Hungary declared war. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. France prepared to aid its ally. Germany, facing the prospect of a two-front war, activated its military plans. Germany's war strategy was shaped by the Schlieffen Plan, named after former Chief of Staff Alfred von Schlieffen, and anticipating a conflict with both France and Russia. The plan called for a rapid strike against France through Belgium, aiming to defeat France swiftly before Russia could fully mobilize. This required violating Belgian neutrality, which Germany believed would be a temporary inconvenience. Instead, the invasion of Belgium triggered British intervention, transforming a regional conflict into a global war. German armies swept into Belgium and northern France with remarkable speed. Early victories suggested that a quick triumph might be possible. But the advance stalled near the Marne River, and both sides dug trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. What had begun as a war of movement soon devolved into a brutal stalemate. Trench warfare defined the Western Front. Soldiers lived in deep ditches under constant threat of artillery fire, sniper shots, gas attacks, and disease. Mud, rats, and barbed wire became part of daily life. Battles that cost thousands of lives often resulted in little or no territorial gain. Weapons, technology, machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas made defense far stronger than offense. The war became one of attrition, grinding down armies and nations alike. While the Western Front stagnated, Germany achieved more success in the east. German forces defeated Russian armies in battles such as Tannenberg and the Mimarumen Lakes, demonstrating superior strategy and coordination. Yet these victories could not deliver a decisive end to the war. The Eastern Front was vast and Russia could absorb heavy losses. The conflict dragged on, consuming resources and lives on both sides. The German home front faced increasing strain. At the war's outset, national unity seemed strong. Crowds cheered soldiers as they marched off to battle, believing the war would be short. But as the conflict continued year after year, enthusiasm gave way to hardship and exhaustion. The British naval blockade restricted imports of food and raw materials, causing shortages that affected civilians across the empire. Rationing, hunger, and rising prices created widespread suffering. In urban areas, families queued for hours to obtain basic supplies. Malnutrition became common, especially among children and the elderly. The winter known as the turnip winter, when turnips replaced potatoes due to crop failures, and shortages symbolized the crisis facing German society. The government struggled to maintain control while balancing military needs and civilian demands. Political tensions grew. Workers went on strike, demanding better conditions and an end to the war. The Social Democratic Party, once repressed under Bismarck, became divided between those who supported the war effort and those who opposed it. Meanwhile, conservative elites and military leaders gained increasing influence, sidelining civilian politicians. In this environment, the military high command, led by General Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, assumed growing authority. They effectively directed war policy, dominating the government and shaping decisions that affected this entire nation. Their support for unrestricted submarine warfare, aimed at disrupting British supply lines, brought the United States into the war after American ships were sunk. This significantly strengthened the Allied side, adding immense economic and military power to the conflict. Germany also attempted to gain advantage through political means. The government supported revolutionary movements in Russia, believing that destabilizing Russia would weaken the Eastern Front. This strategy succeeded when the Russian Revolution erupted, leading to Russia's withdrawal from the war under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Germany gained vast territories and resources in the east, giving it a temporary strategic advantage, yet victory remained out of reach. Despite gains in the east, the situation in the west had become dire. By the time American troops began arriving in Europe, Germany faced overwhelming pressure. Ludendorff launched a massive spring offensive, hoping to break Allied lines before American forces arrived in full strength. At first, the attack made significant gains, creating deep advances into Allied territory. But the German army suffered heavy casualties and exhausted its reserves. When the Allied counteroffensive began, German forces could no longer hold their positions. By late in the war, collapse seemed inevitable. The military could not sustain the fight. The economy was failing and morale was crumbling. Strikes, protests, and calls for peace swept through German cities. Sailors in the navy mutinied, refusing orders that they believed would lead to useless sacrifice. These uprisings spread, becoming part of a broader revolution. Faced with mounting unrest, the government urged Emperor Wilhelm II to abdicate. He fled to the Netherlands, ending the Hohenzollern monarchy. The new civilian government, led by moderate politicians from the Social Democratic Party, sought an armistice. On the 11th day of the 11th month, fighting ceased. The war was over, but the empire had fallen. The armistice was only the beginning of Germany's post-war challenges. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms, territorial losses, demilitarization, and heavy reparations. German representatives were not allowed to negotiate the terms, creating a sense of humiliation that would linger for decades. Many Germans believed the nation had been betrayed by its leaders, the so-called stab-in-the-back myth, claiming that political enemies had undermined the war effort. This myth, though false, became a powerful weapon in later political struggles. The end of the First World War left Germany in a state of profound uncertainty. The imperial government had collapsed, the Kaiser had fled, and the nation faced military defeat, economic distress, and social unrest. Out of this turmoil emerged a new political experiment, the Weimar Republic. For the first time in German history, a democratic system built on universal suffrage, constitutional rights, and parliamentary governance took shape. Yet from its earliest days, the Republic faced extraordinary challenges. Its leaders attempted to rebuild a shattered nation while navigating powerful political forces that opposed democracy from both the left and the right. The story of the Weimar Republic is one of innovation and hope, but also instability, crisis, and eventual collapse. The Republic took its name from the city of Weimar, where a national assembly gathered to draft a constitution. The choice of Weimar was symbolic. Located far from the turmoil of Berlin, it was associated with Germany's cultural heritage, including figures like Goethe and Schiller. The constitution the assembly produced was among the most progressive in Europe at the time. It established a parliamentary system with an elected president, a chancellor, law accountable to the Richter, and broad civil liberties. For the first time, women gained the right to vote, and proportional representation gave smaller political parties a voice in national politics. But the Republic's birth coincided with Germany's harsh post-war reality. One of the first major issues confronting the new government was the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty imposed territorial losses, limited Germany's military, and demanded reparations payments that many Germans felt were unbearable. Worse still, Germany was forced to accept responsibility for causing the war. This war guilt clause became a source of deep resentment. Many Germans viewed the treaty as a humiliation imposed by victorious powers at a moment of weakness. The Versailles settlement fueled political discord within Germany. Radical groups on the right claimed that the nation had not been defeated militarily, but had been betrayed by civilian leaders who signed the armistice. This accusation, known as the stab-in-the-back myth, spread widely despite lacking any factual basis. It undermined trust in the democratic government and provided ammunition to those who sought a return to authoritarian rule. At the same time, the Republic faced threats from the left. Inspired by the Russian Revolution, communist groups believed the war had proven the failures of capitalism and monarchy. They formed councils of workers and soldiers, demanding revolutionary change. In cities like Berlin, Munich, and Bremen, uprisings erupted as leftist factions attempted to seize power. The government relied on paramilitary groups, known as the Freikorps, composed largely of former soldiers, to suppress these revolts. Although effective in the short term, the use of these deeply nationalist and often extremist militias created new problems. Many Freikorps members later joined right-wing movements that opposed the Republic. Amid these political battles, the German economy descended into crisis. Reparations payments placed a heavy burden on the state budget. When the government struggled to meet these demands, foreign creditors lost confidence. The situation worsened when France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr's industrial heartland to enforce reparations. German workers responded with a strike, refusing to cooperate with the occupiers. To support them, the government printed money to pay wages. This decision triggered one of the most severe episodes of hyperinflation in modern history. Prices spiraled out of control, savings evaporated. A loaf of bread that had once cost a handful of marks soon required wheelbarrows full of banknotes. Middle-class families, who had once relied on savings and steady incomes, saw their financial security destroyed. Pensioners, civil servants, and small business owners suffered immense hardship. Some people turned to barter, others lost everything. The crisis created lasting bitterness and weakened trust in democratic institutions. Yet even in these difficult years, the Weimar Republic showed surprising resilience. Under the leadership of Gustav Stresemann, a statesman who served briefly as chancellor and later as foreign minister, the government introduced measures to stabilize the currency and restore economic order. A new currency, the Rent and Mark, replaced the worthless paper money. International agreements such as the Dawes Plan restructured reparations and brought foreign loans into the economy, allowing Germany to rebuild its industries. During this period, often called the Golden Twenties, Germany experienced a remarkable cultural flowering. Berlin became a center of modern art, architecture, cinema, and theater. Writers explored new themes of urban life and personal freedom. Painters experimented with bold forms. Directors like FWMNO and Fritz Lang brought German cinema to international prominence. Nightlife, cabarets, and jazz clubs flourished. For many, especially in the cities, the decade offered a sense of optimism and renewal. But beneath the surface, the Republic remained fragile. Economic recovery depended heavily on foreign loans, especially from the United States. Political fragmentation persisted as dozens of parties competed for influence in the Reichstag. Proportional representation, while democratic, made it difficult to form stable governments. Cabinets rose and fell frequently, and coalition politics became increasingly complicated. Extremist groups continued to challenge the Republic. On the right, nationalist organizations glorified militarism and rejected democracy. One such group was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by a charismatic figure named Adolf Hitler. In the early 1920s, Hitler and his followers attempted a coup in Munich, later known as the Beer Hall Push. The coup failed and Hitler was imprisoned. Yet he used his time in prison to refine his ideology and write his political manifesto. Meanwhile, on the left, communist groups remained determined to overthrow the parliamentary system. Although they never received majority support, their presence fueled fears of revolution and helped push many voters toward conservative or nationalist parties. The Republic's greatest vulnerability emerged when the global economy faltered. The Great Depression began with the crash of the New York stock market and quickly spread across the world. Germany, dependent on foreign investment and still struggling with reparations, was hit especially hard. Factories closed, and unemployment soared, and banks collapsed. Millions of families lost their livelihoods. Hunger and despair became widespread. As economic catastrophe deepened, faith in democratic institutions eroded, voters turned to parties that promised radical solutions. The Social Democrats struggled to address the crisis. Conservatives demanded authoritarian measures and extremists gained momentum. The National Socialist Party, once marginal, presented itself as the champion of national renewal, economic revival, and restored pride. Hitler promised jobs, unity and strength. Many desperate citizens found his message appealing despite or because of his extremism. The collapse of the Weimar Republic opened the door to one of the darkest and most destructive chapters in German and world history. Out of economic crisis, political paralysis, and widespread disillusionment, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party rose to absolute power. Within a remarkably short time, Germany was transformed from a fragile democracy into a totalitarian state that controlled nearly all aspects of public and private life. Fueled by racial ideology, militarism, and territorial ambition, the Nazi regime unleashed unprecedented violence. First against its own citizens, and then across Europe. The consequences reshaped the world and left a lasting scar on Germany's national memory. When Hitler became chancellor, many politicians believed they could harness his popularity while keeping him in check. Instead, he moved swiftly to dismantle the democratic system. The turning point came after a fire destroyed the Reichstag building. Although the circumstances of the fire remain debated, Hitler used the event to claim that Germany faced a communist threat. He persuaded President Paul von Hindenburg to issue emergency decrees suspending civil liberties, enabling mass arrests of political opponents. Soon after, Hitler pushed through the Enabling Act, which granted his government the authority to enact laws without parliamentary approval. With this, the legal framework of democracy collapsed. Political parties were banned or dissolved. Under pressure, and the Nazi Party became the sole political force in Germany. Trade unions were abolished, their leaders arrested, and workers forced into a state-controlled labor organization. The press, radio, and cultural institutions came under strict supervision, silencing dissenting voices and broadcasting Nazi propaganda. Hitler positioned himself as the embodiment of the nation. After President Hindenburg's death, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, adopting the title of Führer. Loyalty to him became a central obligation of German citizenship. Public life was saturated with displays of allegiance, mass rallies, parades, and slogans designed to portray the Nazis as the saviors of a humiliated nation. Underlying the regime's public image was a core ideology rooted in racism and anti-Semitism. The Nazis promoted the idea of a racial hierarchy, placing so-called Aryans at the top and labeling others as inferior or dangerous. Jews became the primary target of hatred, blamed falsely for Germany's problems, and depicted as a threat to the purity and survival of the nation. Other groups, including Roma people, people with disabilities, homosexuals, political dissident, and religious minorities were also condemned and persecuted. One of the Nazis' earliest steps toward racial control was the enactment of the Nuremberg Laws. These laws stripped Jews of citizenship, prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and imposed severe limitations on participation in public life. Jewish businesses were targeted through boycotts, confiscations, and restrictions, forcing many families into poverty. Anti-Semitic propaganda filled newspapers, posters, and classrooms, shaping public attitudes and normalizing discrimination. At the same time, the regime sought to mobilize society through massive public works and economic programs. The Nazis invested in highway construction, rearmament, and conscription, reducing unemployment and fueling economic growth. These programs won support from many Germans who had suffered during the Depression. Yet this apparent prosperity depended heavily on military expansion and the exclusion of Jews and other marginalized groups from economic life. With the military strengthened, Hitler pursued his long-standing goal of overturning the post-war international order. Germany withdrew from the League of Nations, rebuilt its armed forces in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and militarized the Rhineland. Each step tested the resolve of Britain and France, which, hoping to avoid another major war, responded with caution rather than confrontation. Hitler's territorial ambitions soon became clear. He aimed to unite all German-speaking peoples into a single Reich and to secure living space in Eastern Europe. The first major expansion came with the annexation of Austria, a move welcomed by many Austrians and met with little opposition from the international community. This was followed by demands for the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. Britain and France agreed to cede the territory to Germany in the hope of preserving peace. Instead, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia soon after, revealing the emptiness of his promises. As Germany grew bolder, European tensions reached a breaking point. Hitler's next focus was Poland. To avoid a two-front war, he negotiated a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, a shocking agreement between two ideologically opposed regimes. The pact included secret provisions to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Confident in Soviet neutrality, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war, and the Second World War began. The early years of the war brought sweeping victories for Germany. Blitzkrieg tactics combining tanks, aircraft, and fast-moving infantry overwhelmed Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. German forces advanced rapidly, and by mid-war, most of Western Europe was under Nazi control. Britain resisted, successfully defending its skies during the Battle of Britain, but much of the continent lay under occupation. Life in occupied territories varied, but Nazi rule was often brutal. Political opponents were arrested, resources were seized, and civilian populations faced harsh measures. In Eastern Europe, the Nazis pursued even more extreme policies. Hitler viewed the region as the key to securing living space for Germans and saw its inhabitants as racially inferior. This ideology formed the foundation for one of the most horrific crimes in history, the Holocaust. The Holocaust did not begin with death camps, but with escalating measures of exclusion, violence, and forced migration. As the war expanded eastward, Nazi leaders authorized the systematic murder of Jews, Roma people, and others deemed undesirable. Mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the army into the Soviet Union, executing civilians in mass shootings. Entire communities were wiped out. The establishment of extermination camps marked a new phase of genocide. Camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor were built for the sole purpose of mass murder. Millions of Jews were transported by train to these camps, where most were killed upon arrival. Others were subjected to forced labor, starvation, medical experiments, and torture. The scale of the Holocaust remains one of the most horrifying atrocities in human history. Meanwhile, military fortunes began to turn against Germany. The invasion of the Soviet Union launched with vast initial success. They eventually stalled due to harsh weather, extended supply lines, and fierce Soviet resistance. The Battle of Stalingrad became a decisive turning point, ending with the surrender of a large German army. In North Africa, German and Italian forces were defeated, allowing Allied armies to advance into southern Europe. Bombing campaigns devastated German cities, destroying factories, transportation networks, and civilian neighborhoods. When the Second World War finally ended, Germany lay in a state of devastation that seemed almost beyond comprehension. The collapse of the Nazi regime had left the country leaderless, exhausted, and physically shattered. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Millions were displaced, and families searched for missing relatives amid the ruins. The defeat had not simply ended a war. It had unraveled the political, social, and moral fabric of the nation. In the years that followed, Germany underwent a profound transformation shaped by occupation, justice, reconstruction, and the emergence of two separate states. In the immediate aftermath of the surrender, the victorious Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France took control of the defeated nation. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, each administered by one of the Allied powers. Berlin, the capital, was similarly divided despite lying deep within the Soviet zone. This arrangement, intended as a temporary measure, soon became the foundation for a divided Germany. The primary goals of the Allies were demilitarization, denazification, democratization, denatification. They sought to dismantle the structures that had allowed the Nazi regime to gain and maintain power. Factories that had produced weapons were shut down. Military organizations were dissolved. High-ranking Nazi officials were arrested. Allied control councils passed directives aimed at removing Nazi influence from public life, education, and government. Perhaps the most symbolic expression of the Allies' commitment to justice was the Nuremberg trials, held in the Bavarian city that had once hosted massive Nazi rallies. These trials brought leading figures of the regime before an international court. Prosecutors charged defendants with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Evidence presented included documents, photographs, and testimony from survivors. The proceedings established a precedent in international law by holding individuals, not just states, accountable for atrocities committed under governmental authority. The Nuremberg trials had multiple purposes. They aimed to punish those most responsible for the horrors of the regime, to educate the world about the extent of Nazi crimes, and to lay the groundwork for a future international legal order. The trials revealed the systematic nature of the Holocaust and exposed the machinery of repression, propaganda, and terror that had sustained the dictatorship. Although not all perpetrators were tried, and not all trials resulted in severe penalties, Nuremberg became a defining moment in Germany's reckoning with its past. While the trials were underway, daily life for ordinary Germans was marked by hardship. Millions lived in temporary shelters or damaged buildings. Food shortages persisted and rationing continued for years. Refugees streamed into the country from eastern territories that Germany had lost. Entire communities fled, advancing Soviet forces, enduring hunger, disease, and violence. The sheer scale of displacement created overwhelming challenges for the occupying authorities and local populations. Reconstruction required cooperation between the Allies and Germans, who were willing to help rebuild their society. Schools reopened, municipal governments resumed basic functions, and essential services slowly returned. Churches, civic groups, and volunteer organizations played vital roles in providing assistance, yet political life remained tightly controlled as the Allies worked to dismantle authoritarian structures and encourage democratic principles. One major step in the political reorganization of Germany was the decision to decentralize power. The Nazi regime had relied on extreme centralization, using a unified state apparatus to enforce its ideology. To prevent such concentration of power from returning, the Allies encouraged the creation of federal states known as Länder, each with its own parliament and government. This structure laid the foundation for regional autonomy in post-war Germany. As time passed, the cooperation among the Allied powers began to deteriorate. The wartime alliance had been held together by the common goal of defeating Nazi Germany, but after victory, differences in political ideology, economic priorities, and global ambitions came to the forefront. The United States and Britain favored economic recovery and democratic development, while the Soviet Union aimed to secure its Western orders and spread socialist influence. These conflicting visions led to increasing tension, marking the beginning of the Cold War. Economic recovery became a crucial battleground in this ideological struggle. The Soviet Union dismantled factories in its zone and transported equipment to rebuild its own war-torn territories. In contrast, the Western Allies eventually shifted from punitive policies to support for reconstruction. The United States introduced the Marshall Plan, a program that provided financial aid to help rebuild European economies and strengthen democratic institutions. West German industry benefited significantly from this assistance, accelerating recovery. The growing divide between the East and the West made joint administration of Germany increasingly difficult. Decisions in the Allied Control Council often ended in stalemate. As a result, the Western zones began to coordinate more closely with one another, forming a unified economic area known as the B Zone and later the Tree Zone. When the French zone joined, the Soviet Union viewed these actions with suspicion, fearing that the West intended to create a separate German state aligned against it. The decisive break came with the introduction of a new currency in the Western zones, the Deutsche Mark. This reform sought to combat inflation, stabilize the economy, and encourage growth. The Soviet authorities opposed the move and responded by blockading all land and water routes to West Berlin, hoping to force the Western Allies to abandon the city. The Berlin blockade became one of the first major crises of the Cold War. In response, the United States and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, an extraordinary operation in which aircraft delivered food, coal, and other essential supplies to the city's residents. Day and night, planes landed at West Berlin's airports, ensuring the population survived this airport's blockade. After months of pressure, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade. The airlift became a symbol of Western resolve and a defining moment in the emerging division of Europe, with tensions rising and cooperation impossible. The Western Allies supported the creation of a new German state in their zones. Representatives from the Länder drafted a constitution that established a democratic federal republic. In the late 1940s, the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany, came into being with Bern as its provisional capital. The new republic emphasized human rights, the rule of law, and parliamentary democracy, seeking to avoid the weaknesses that had plagued the the Weimar era. In the Soviet zone, a different system took shape. Under the influence of the Soviet Union, the Socialist Unity Party consolidated power, merging communist and socialist groups. The political structure was built on the principles of a one-party socialist state, aligned with the broader goals of the Eastern Bloc. In the late 1940s, the German Democratic Republic, known as East Germany, was proclaimed. East Berlin became its capital, though the city as a whole remained divided. In the years following the establishment of two separate German states, the contrast between them grew increasingly stark. The Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east represented not only different political systems, but different visions of society, economy, and identity. Their development unfolded under the shadow of the Cold War, shaped by competing alliances, global tensions, and the daily lives of millions of ordinary people whose experiences diverged dramatically depending on which side of the divide they called home. The Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany, emerged from the rubble of war, determined to build a stable and democratic society. Its leaders sought to avoid the mistakes of the Weimar era, particularly political fragmentation, economic instability, and the weakness of democratic institutions. The Basic Law, the new state's constitution, established a parliamentary democracy with clearly defined rights, checks and balances, and protections against authoritarianism. Federalism distributed power between the national government and the Länder, preventing the concentration of authority that had characterized the Nazi regime. Konrad Adenauer, West Germany's first chancellor, played a central role in shaping the country's early direction. Adenauer emphasized integration with Western Europe and the Atlantic community. He believed that Germany's future depended on cooperation rather than dominance. Under his leadership, West Germany joined organizations such as the Council of Europe, the European Coal and Steel Community, and eventually the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These steps strengthened West Germany's ties with France, Britain, the United States, and other democracies. Economically, West Germany experienced a remarkable period of recovery known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. With support from the Marshall Plan and guided by the principles of a social market economy, the nation rebuilt its industrial base. The social market model combined free enterprise with social policies designed to protect workers and ensure basic welfare. Factories reopened, new technologies emerged, and skilled laborers returned to work. Cities rebuilt their infrastructure, and modern housing developments replaced ruins left by the war. The economic miracle transformed daily life. For many families, the 1950s and 1960s brought rising incomes, increased consumption, and new opportunities. Household appliances, automobiles, and televisions became symbols of prosperity. Millions of refugees and displaced persons found jobs and homes in the growing economy. Migration from rural areas to urban centers accelerated, and West Germany became known for its efficiency, innovation, and high standards of living. Social change accompanied economic growth. Reforms in education expanded opportunities for young people. New universities were founded, and existing institutions modernized their curricula. The arts flourished, with filmmakers, writers, and musicians contributing to a vibrant cultural scene. Yet, not all developments were smooth. The Republic struggled to confront its Nazi past. Many former Nazis held positions in government, the judiciary, and industry. Debate over responsibility and memory became increasingly important, especially among younger generations. Political life in the Federal Republic stabilized over time. The Social Democratic Party evolved from its Weimar-era roots, embracing democratic principles and participating in coalitions that shaped national policy. By the late 1960s, West Germany was led by Chancellor Willy Brandt, whose policy of Ostpolitik aimed to ease tensions with the Eastern Bloc. Brandt sought dialogue with East Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union, recognizing the need for reconciliation and cooperation in a divided Europe. His gesture of kneeling at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial symbolized a new willingness to confront Germany's past with humility and responsibility. While West Germany embraced democracy and economic integration, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany developed under a very different set of circumstances. Established within the Soviet zone, East Germany adopted a socialist system modeled on Soviet principles. The Socialist Unity Party, formed by merging the Communist and Socialist parties under Soviet direction, became the dominant political force. The new state claimed to represent the working class and portray itself as a socialist alternative to capitalist exploitation. The East German government nationalized industry, collectivized agriculture, and centralized planning. Factories, mines, and utilities became state-owned enterprises. Agricultural land was reorganized into collective farms. 5-year plans set production goals and directed resources. While these policies produced some industrial growth, especially in heavy industry, they also created inefficiencies and shortages. Consumer goods were limited, and many products remained scarce or of lower quality than those available in the West. The state emphasized ideological education and loyalty to socialism. Schools taught Marxist-Leninist principles. Youth organizations such as the Free German Youth shaped the political consciousness of young people. Art, literature, and media came under state supervision, promoting themes of workers' solidarity, anti-fascism, and collective responsibility. Independent expression was discouraged or suppressed. To maintain political control, the East German government relied heavily on the Ministry for State Security, widely known as the Stasi. This organization became one of the most extensive and intrusive secret police forces in the world. It monitored citizens through informants, surveillance, and detailed files. Neighbors reported on neighbors, co-workers reported on co-workers, and even family members were sometimes pressured to provide information. The Stasi's presence created a climate of fear that shaped everyday interactions. Despite its authoritarian nature, East Germany developed strong social programs. Housing, healthcare, and education were guaranteed. Women participated widely in the workforce and received supports such as childcare and parental leave. The government promoted sports and physical education, leading to impressive performances by East German athletes in International competitions. Many citizens appreciated the stability and security these programs provided, even as they resented political repression and economic limitations. The most dramatic symbol of Germany's division was the Berlin Wall. In the years after the war, thousands of East Germans fled to the West, seeking better economic conditions and political freedom. Many used Berlin as a route, moving from the eastern sector to the western sector to the western sectors before leaving the city. To halt this exodus, East German authorities with Soviet approval constructed a physical barrier. Built overnight, the wall cut through streets, neighborhoods, and even family homes. Guard towers, barbed wire, and a no-man's land made escape extremely dangerous. The wall became a stark representation of the ideological and human separation between the two Germanys. Life, on either side of the wall, moved forward, but in different rhythms. In West Germany, democratic institutions deepened, economic prosperity expanded, and cultural diversity increased. In East Germany, the state maintained tight control, promoted socialist identity, and struggled with ongoing shortages and immigration pressures. Yet despite their differences, both states shared a common history and a divided sense of nationhood. By the 1970s and 1980s, the global landscape was changing. Dante eased some Cold War tensions, allowing increased cultural exchange and limited travel between East and West Germany. Economic cooperation grew slowly and everyday contacts, though restricted, became more frequent. Still, the wall stood as both a literal and symbolic barrier. In East Germany, dissatisfaction gradually intensified. Economic stagnation, environmental problems, and lack of political freedoms fueled discontent. The Stasi surveillance contributed to a climate of mistrust. Younger generations who had known only socialist rule increasingly questioned the system's legitimacy. Peace groups, church communities, and grassroots movements began to organize, often under the protection of religious institutions that enjoyed limited autonomy. West Germany, by contrast, continued to strengthen its economy and international role. The country became a founding member of the European Economic Community and a key partner in Western alliances. West German artists, scholars, and activists contributed to a vibrant public sphere that engaged in debates about memory, justice, and global responsibility. Through these developments, the Federal Republic became known for its democratic stability and commitment to human rights. By the late 1980s, the German Democratic Republic faced mounting internal pressure and a rapidly changing international environment. For decades, East German authorities had maintained strict control through surveillance, censorship, and limited economic reforms. But beneath the surface, dissatisfaction had grown steadily. The younger generation, raised entirely within the socialist system, struggled with shortages, restricted travel, and limited opportunities. At the same time, the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev introduced sweeping reforms, glasnost, and Parisa, that encouraged more open discussion and economic restructuring. These changes sent a powerful signal across Eastern Europe, including East Germany, where many citizens hoped for similar reforms. The East German leadership, however, remained deeply resistant to change. Under the long rule of Erich Honecker, the state had refused to adapt to shifting political realities. While neighboring countries such as Hungary and Poland experimented with economic liberalization and political dialogue, East German authorities continued to enforce strict ideological conformity. The Berlin Wall, built decades earlier to prevent immigration, stood as a remnant of state power and division. Yet by the late 1980s, the structure that once seemed permanent was becoming increasingly vulnerable. One of the first major cracks appeared in Hungary. In a dramatic shift, the Hungarian government began dismantling its border fence with Austria and allowed East Germans vacationing in the country to travel westward. Thousands of East German citizens took advantage of this unexpected opening, fleeing through Hungary into Austria and then to West Germany. The East German government attempted to stop the flow by pressuring Hungary and restricting travel, but the movement had begun to gather momentum. Eastern Europeans were challenging the borders of the Cold War. At home, protests gained strength. Churches played a crucial role by offering safe spaces where citizens could gather, discuss grievances, and plan peaceful demonstrations. The most influential of these gatherings took place at St. Nicholas Church in Leipzig, where weekly prayers for peace gradually evolved into mass protests. Initially small and modest, the demonstrations grew steadily, drawing citizens who demanded freedom of expression, the right to travel, and political reform. The chant, "Wir sind das Volk," "We are the people," became the rallying cry of a movement that insisted on the right to shape its own destiny. The East German government responded with a mixture of intimidation and hesitation. Security forces were deployed, and the possibility of violent repression loomed. Many feared a repeat of the Tiananmen Square crackdown that had taken place in China earlier that year. Yet, unlike in past crises, the leadership found itself divided and uncertain. Soviet support for hardline measures was no longer guaranteed, and Honecker's rigid stance alienated even some members of the ruling Socialist Unity Party. As protests spread to cities such as Dresden, Berlin, and Rostow, the pressure on the government intensified. Honecker was eventually forced to resign, replaced by Egon Krenn, who promised limited reforms. But the pace of events had already outstripped the leadership's control. Citizens demanded not only reforms, but fundamental change. The pivotal moment came in Berlin. With immigration spiraling and public demonstrations growing, the government attempted to revise its travel regulations. In a confused press conference, an official announced that East Germans would be allowed to apply for travel visas immediately. The wording was unclear, and journalists pressed for clarification, believing the new policy took effect at once. News quickly spread across East Berlin. As the evening progressed, thousands of East Germans gathered at checkpoints along the Berlin Wall, demanding passage to the west. Border guards, unprepared for the sudden surge and lacking clear instructions, hesitated. After years of rigid control, the system faltered under the weight of public pressure. One checkpoint after another opened and crowds flowed freely across the barrier that had divided families, friends, and communities for decades. Scenes of jubilation erupted. East and West Berliners climbed onto the wall, embraced and celebrated through the night. Musicians played impromptu concerts atop the concrete barrier. Families reunited with tears and laughter. Strangers shared bottles of champagne while television crews captured images that flashed across the world. The fall of the Berlin Wall became more than a political event. It became a global symbol of freedom, unity, and the power of peaceful protest. In the weeks that followed, East Germany underwent rapid transformation. The ruling Socialist Unity Party lost its grip as new political movements emerged. Free elections were held, and parties supporting reunification gained strong backing. The East German economy, long burdened by inefficiency and shortages, faced collapse, accelerating calls for integration with the prosperous Federal Republic. Reunification, however, was not simply a matter of public enthusiasm. It required delicate diplomacy involving the four powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, who had retained legal rights over Germany since the end of the Second World War. Negotiations explored security concerns, economic arrangements, and the future of international alliances. A key question concerned membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Soviet Union initially opposed, allowing a united Germany to remain in the alliance. After extensive discussions and assurances regarding troop deployments, Soviet leaders agreed to support reunification. Inside Germany, leaders from East and West worked to harmonize political, economic, and legal systems. The West German Basic Law provided the constitutional framework for unification, ensuring that democratic principles, individual rights, and federal structures would extend across the entire country. The transition posed significant challenges. East German industry struggled to compete with Western markets, and unemployment rose sharply. Yet, despite the difficulties, the momentum for unity remained strong. On the third day of the 10th month in the early 1990s, the German Democratic Republic formally dissolved and its states joined the Federal Republic. The moment was celebrated across Germany, culminating in official ceremonies at the Reichstag and Brandenburg Gate. For some, it was the realization of a long-held dream. For others, especially in East Germany, reunification brought uncertainty and loss as familiar institutions disappeared and social structures shifted. Nevertheless, the historic significance of the event was undeniable. A nation divided by war, ideology, and geopolitica, rivalry had come together once more. Reunification reshaped the political landscape of Europe. Germany emerged as a leading member of the European Community, later the European Union, advocating for integration, cooperation, and collective prosperity. The country's democratic institutions expanded, and debates over national identity, memory, and global responsibility took on new urgency. German leaders emphasized the importance of confronting the past, fostering peace, and supporting international stability. At the same time, reunification revealed enduring disparities. The economic divide between the former East and West persisted, affecting wages, employment, and infrastructure. Cultural differences shaped perceptions and attitudes. Efforts to address these divisions required long-term investment, dialogue, and policy reforms. Yet through these challenges, Germany continued to strengthen the foundations of its united state. The reunification of Germany marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by possibility, responsibility, and profound transformation. The United Nations emerged from the Cold War as the largest economy in Europe, positioned at the political and geographic heart of the continent. No longer divided by walls or ideologies, Germany faced a different challenge, shaping its place in a rapidly changing world while confronting its complex past, integrating diverse communities, and adapting to economic and political shifts that extended far beyond its borders. In the years following reunification, Germany undertook the enormous task of merging two very different societies. West Germany brought a well-established democratic structure, a prosperous market economy, and institutions shaped by decades of integration with Western Europe. East Germany brought a state-run economy, a legacy of surveillance and restricted freedoms, and a population that had lived under socialism for generations. The task of unification required extensive investments in infrastructure, social programs, and economic restructuring. The federal government committed significant resources to rebuilding the eastern states. Roads, bridges, railways, and utilities were modernized. Factories that had once operated under state management were privatized or closed. New businesses emerged slowly, supported by incentives designed to attract investment. Despite these efforts, economic disparities persisted. Many people from the former East migrated westward in search of better opportunities, leaving some regions with declining populations and limited employment prospects. These differences in wages, wealth, and opportunity created a lingering sense of uneven development, sometimes described in public discourse as the wall in people's minds. At the same time, Germany strengthened its role within Europe. The country became a driving force in the expansion and deepening of the European Union. It supported economic cooperation, the creation of the common currency, and policies aimed at ensuring stability and growth across the continent. Successive German leaders emphasized the importance of partnership, multilateral decision-making, and collective accountability. The memory of past conflicts reinforced Germany's commitment to diplomacy, integration, and peace. Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who had guided the reunification process, worked tirelessly to build bridges between Germany and its neighbors. His successors continued this approach. Gerhard Schröder introduced economic reforms intended to improve competitiveness and address rising unemployment. Angela Merkel, Germany's first female chancellor, became one of the most influential political figures in Europe. Her leadership during financial crisis, migration debates, and international conflicts shaped Germany's global reputation as a stabilizing force. Germany's relationship with its past remained central to its national identity. Even as the country looked forward, it continued to examine the legacy of the Nazi era and the Holocaust with deep seriousness. Memorials, museums, and educational programs sought to ensure that future generations would understand the consequences of hatred, authoritarianism, and intolerance. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin became a powerful symbol of remembrance and responsibility. School curricula emphasized human rights, democratic values, and critical thinking. Public debate frequently revisited historical questions, ensuring that memory remained an integral part of civic life. This commitment to remembrance shaped Germany's responses to new challenges. When waves of refugees and migrants arrived from regions experiencing war, persecution, and instability, Germany faced difficult decisions about how to balance humanitarian responsibility with social cohesion and political realities. The arrival of large numbers of newcomers sparked intense debate. Advocates emphasized moral duty and the benefits of diversity, while critics expressed concerns about integration, cultural change, and economic pressure. The issue highlighted broader questions about identity in a changing society. Germany, once thought of as ethnically and culturally uniform, had become increasingly diverse. Immigrant communities from Turkey, the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe contributed to the nation's cultural, economic, and social life. Cities such as Berlin, Frankfurt, and Hamburg became multicultural hubs, reflecting global influences in food, art, music, and entrepreneurship. Yet, integration remained an ongoing challenge shaped by debates about citizenship, language, religion, and shared values. Economically, Germany maintained its position as one of the world's leading industrial and technological powers. Its companies produced advanced machinery, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and green technologies. The emphasis on vocational training and apprenticeships created a skilled workforce admired internationally. Exports drove economic growth, making Germany a key player in global trade. However, the nation also grappled with demographic changes. An aging population and low birth rates raised concerns about future labor shortages, social security funding, and long-term economic sustainability. The political landscape evolved as well. Traditional parties faced increasing competition from new movements that reflected shifting priorities and frustrations. Environmental concerns gained prominence, with the Green Party advocating for renewable energy, sustainability, and climate action. Populist parties on both the left and the right attracted support by voicing dissatisfaction with globalization, migration, and economic inequality. These changes challenged the stability of long-standing political coalitions and forced debates about the direction of German and European policy. Germany's role on the international stage continued to grow. It became a mediator in global conflicts, a champion of multilateral diplomacy, and a key partner in humanitarian and environmental initiatives. German soldiers participated in peacekeeping missions, and German diplomats engaged in negotiations on nuclear agreements, climate policies, and development aid. At times, critics argued that Germany's cautious approach limited its influence. Supporters countered that measured leadership, rooted in historical awareness, was a strength rather than a weakness. Culturally, reunified Germany experienced a renaissance. Berlin emerged as a global center for art, music, and innovation, attracting creators from around the world, literature, film, and theater explored themes of memory, identity, and transformation. Writers examined the experiences of life in the former East, the challenges of integration, and the complexities of modern German identity. Filmmakers produced works that gained international acclaim, addressing both contemporary issues and historical reflection. The German people continued to engage in national dialogue about the lessons of the past and the responsibilities of the present. Public discussions often centered on democracy, human rights, and the importance of civic participation. Educational initiatives encouraged young people to confront extremism, racism, and anti-Semitism. Organizations dedicated to remembrance preserved the stories of victims and survivors, ensuring that history remained a living part of collective consciousness. Over time, Germany also played a significant role in shaping Europe's economic and political direction during financial crises affecting countries like Greece, Spain, and Portugal. Germany advocated for fiscal responsibility and structural reforms. Critics accused the government of imposing strict conditions, while supporters argued that stability required careful management. These debates reflected larger questions about the future of the European Union, including integration, sovereignty, and solidarity. Environmental policy became another defining issue. Germany committed to reducing carbon emissions, investing in renewable energy, and phasing out nuclear power. These initiatives generated both praise and controversy, influencing global climate discussions. The nation's engineering expertise and technological innovation positioned it as a leader in sustainable development, even as it faced challenges in transitioning away from fossil fuels. At the same time, Germany continued to grapple with complex social issues. The rise of digital technologies, changing labor markets, and increasing automation raised concerns about inequality and job security. Debates over data privacy and digital infrastructure shaped national policy. Questions about the future of the welfare state, the balance between economic growth and environmental protection, and the integration of diverse communities formed the core of political discourse. Despite these challenges, Germany's post-reunification journey demonstrated resilience. The nation rebuilt trust in democratic institutions, embraced its role within Europe, and cultivated a political culture grounded in dialogue and responsibility. Its ability to navigate crisis, economic, social, and international, reflected a commitment to stability and cooperation. Germany today stands as a nation shaped by ancient tribal cultures, medieval empires, religious transformations, wars, division, and reunification. Its history is marked by extraordinary achievements and profound tragedies. Through these experiences, Germany has developed a distinctive identity, defined by remembrance, responsibility, and a constant search for balance in an ever-changing world. As it moves further into the 21st century, Germany continues to redefine itself, guided by its history, challenged by new realities, and connected to global developments that transcend borders. The story of Germany is not merely the account of a nation's past, it is an ongoing journey that reflects the complexities of human society, the impact of choices, and the enduring possibility of renewal.